Hey, how's it going, everyone? This is a presentation that deals with the belief systems of the Africans who fell victim to the transatlantic slave trade. I began working on this back in September of this year, and I'm finally, wrapping it up. So, um, if you've got a few extra hours to kill, sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Now, first things first. This is a quote by a longtime family friend and mentor of mine. Um, he would always tell me this. He'd say, "Never blindly believe anything, because to believe is to be potentially lied to. Always do your research." And I want you guys to keep this in mind as you watch this presentation. Um, I'm not a historian, I'm not a professor or anything like that. I'm an enthusiast at best who has a lot of extra time thanks to the quarantine. So do your due diligence. If something doesn't sit right with you or you think it may be wrong, please do your research. I highly encourage it. Now, TLDR, if you don't feel like watching the entire presentation, these are the four. We've got various traditional African systems such as Odinani, Inri, and Dogon, and as well as along with hundreds of others. We've got Judaism, Islam, and early Christianity pre-Constantine. Now, if you are looking for to learn more about traditional African beliefs, I highly recommend checking out Home Team History on YouTube. Um, they've got tons of super extensive research and information on their channel, so I highly recommend checking them out. This presentation will focus almost solely on Abrahamic teachings and their origins within the continent. So if that's not something you're interested in, you may want to click away now. With regards to citations, I've used mostly educational videos for more of the well-known and agreed-upon history, and I've relied more on encyclopedias for some things that may be controversial or lesser known. And I'll make sure to include the citations in the description of this video. And before I begin, I just want to give a huge shout out to these two men right here, George Miller and Eha Viver. George Miller, longtime mentor, close family friend, and Eha Viver is a man in Israel who I reached out to. I sent him an email, and he took 4 hours out of his day to teach me a lot about Jewish history and a lot about his life. So Ehav, if you ever get a chance to watch this, I sincerely appreciate everything that you've taught me. And with that said, if there's any misinformation or controversial views in this presentation, I'd like to let it be known now that they're mine and mine alone. They do not represent the thoughts of either of these two men. So what's the purpose? Why am I making this? Well, there's three key reasons. One, there's a lot of frustration amongst today's African descendants as far as where we come from, what we believed before, and there's a lot of conflicting and or false information out there. And also, we just passed the 400-year anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade beginning in on the Virginia shores. Now, it started, it'd been going on for a few centuries prior, but 1619 is the agreed upon start date of United States slavery. Now, fair warning, I am biased towards Christianity since I myself am a practicing Christian. So I will be, you may notice that there's a lot more information surrounding that. What's it going to say here? Okay, yeah, and like I said, most of the information in this presentation is going to focus on the Abrahamic teachings. It's just something to keep in mind. Now here's the table of contents. So I'm going to start from a prehistory, a little bit of that. I'm going to talk a bit about ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia. We're going to skip ahead into a little bit about Egypt, the rise and fall of Judea, Ghana, Mali, Songhai Empire, and West Africa. These three Islamic caliphates that expanded across northern Africa. Various events that took place in and around the year 1492. And I'm going to talk about both the beginnings of the slave trade and the actual beginning of the slave trade in Northern America. So, without further ado, let's begin. prehistory. So, once upon a time, there was nothing, and then we had the Big Bang, right? Well, small problem here. The world looks much different. It's more like this. In reality, Africa is one of the largest land masses on the planet Earth. Um, it's several times larger than the country of Greenland, and the United States and Western Europe is dwarfs in comparison. Now, this is going to give you a bit more context. So, this is how Greenland actually compares to Africa. In reality, Africa is about 14 and a half times larger than Greenland. Greenland is only approximately 2 million square kilometers, whereas Africa is nearly 30 million square kilometers. And while we're on the subject of the size of different countries, this is the relative size of Alaska compared to the other states in the United States. Alaska is a bit more than twice as large as Texas, or I should say roughly about twice the size as Texas. It's more than 566,000 square miles, whereas Texas is only 262,000 square miles. Now, if you were to look on a standard map, Alaska seems much smaller, but when you compare it with the rest of the country, it is massive by comparison. And here's another photo that, or graphic, I should say, that'll give you a bit more understanding about the sheer magnitude of the size of this continent. We've got the United States. It's about a third of the size. We've got Western Europe, Japan, China, India, and all of these countries that fit within the continent. So why am I showing you this? Well, in order to grasp the information in this presentation, it's important for you to understand the magnitude of the size of Africa. It's not some small, insignificant place, as a lot of us were taught. In fact, it's one of the largest land masses on the planet, and the Western world simply couldn't exist without it. So, the Khoisan people, considered the oldest known people. Now, according to Nature Research Journal, the Khoisan are the oldest known lineage of modern human beings. They're located primarily in southern African countries such as Botswana. So, what does this show us? It shows us that the starting point for humanity began in Africa. Now, this will give us a much clearer picture when trying to understand the later human migrations and civilizations. Moving right along, we're going to go into ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia. So, although life began in southern Africa, this is believed to be the cradle of civilization. Many religions have foundations from ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia, particularly the Abrahamic religions. They're called the Abrahamic religions because they consider a man named Abraham to be their starting point. And the Abrahamic religions are Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is considered the oldest surviving great work of literature, is actually comes from this region. And many people believe that it inspired parts of the book of Genesis. And it has a lot of parallels as well, primarily with the protagonist Gilgamesh. A lot of people compare him to a person by the name of Nimrod in the Old Testament. And the following is a timeline of the different people groups who lived in the region. The Ubaidians were the first civilizing force in Sumer. Unlike the other groups listed on this timeline, the Ubaidians were not considered Semitic, meaning they're not descendants of Noah's son Shem, according to the Judaic understanding. They are most known for draining marshes for agriculture, developing trade, and establishing industries such as weaving, leatherwork, metalwork, masonry, and pottery. After the Ubaidians came the Semitic peoples, and as you can see here on the timeline, around the year 3300 BC. In terms of beliefs, most of the Sumerians were polytheists, meaning that they believed in many gods of various levels of authority and jurisdiction. For example, the Sargon, also known as the Akkadian, believed in a sun god known as Utu. He was the judge of the other gods and in charge of justice and righteousness. Now, one interesting thing about the Amorites is that they're referenced in both the Hebrew Bible and the Torah. the history of Sumer is very expansive, and I would encourage you to read up more about it. But this is really just to give you a broad overview of this part. This part of the planet. And next up, we're going to go into Egypt. Again, this is going to be a brief overview. If you'd like to learn more, this is several thousand years of history, so there's a lot of information out there. So ancient Egypt is one of history's oldest known civilizations, dating back to the 4th millennium BC, and it lasted about 3,000 years. The original name was actually Kemet, meaning black land. Historians estimate that what we consider to be ancient Egypt unified around the year 3100 BC, but there appears to have been roughly 2,000 years of undocumented pre-dynastic history. Their ingenuity and technology was unmatched. According to interestingengineering.com, we can thank the ancient Egyptians for mathematics, geometry, surveying, metallurgy, astronomy, accounting, paper, modern medicine, and much more. In terms of beliefs, it depends on which time period that you look at. Now, during most of its various time periods, Egyptians were considered polytheists, much like the ancient Sumerians. However, during the reign of Akhenaten, monotheism was made to be the belief system of the land. It was believed that Ra, who was a deity associated with the sun, should be adorned alone. And after its nearly 3,000-year lifespan, ancient Egypt fell after the death of Cleopatra VII. And this information is from history.com. You can read more about it there. Now, this is a very important person. Her name was Winifred Brunton. She's responsible for a lot of Egyptian paintings in the early 20th century, and she's the reason why we have a particular image in mind when we think of ancient Egyptians, and I'm going to touch on that in the next slide here. Now, she was a South African woman who was married to a British Egyptologist by the name of Guy Brunton. She was famous for her paintings of Egyptian tombs and Egyptian pharaohs. And her work was carried out in the early part of the 20th century and published as illustrations in 2 volumes consisting of Kings and Queens of Ancient Egypt in 1926 and Great Ones of Ancient Egypt in 1929. And both of those books are highly collectible. And these are some of her paintings. And no, this isn't Kim Kardashian right here. This is these are depictions of high-ranking Egyptian officials, if I'm not mistaken. So don't misunderstand me when I say that this is a misconception. Now we know that there were Greek and or Macedonian Egyptian leaders. Egyptian leaders with Greek or Macedonian heritage. However, that they were not in the majority. So the Hyksos, not ancient Hebrews. So I've heard a lot of folks say that the Hyksos, which were a group that invaded Egypt, were synonymous with the ancient Israelites. And I found 2 sources that actually provided pretty strong arguments against that. So here's just a brief history. Between the years 1630 and 1523 BC, a group of Semitic origin known as the Hyksos invaded Egypt, and some even became pharaohs. Now, many people believe these people to be the ancient Israelites, but there seems to be a misunderstanding. Now, an article with that's linked here to the right from the Torah.com. This is an article written by Dr. David Ben-Gad HaKohen, and in it he argues against this misconception, citing a possible misinterpretation by the Egyptian priest Manetho. I'd also come across an ebook written by David J. Gibson, which gives a thorough comparison between the Edomite kingdoms and that of the Hyksos. And on pages 48 and 49 of his book, titled Edom and the Hyksos, Gibson argues the author of the book of Genesis was in fact describing the first 3 Hyksos kings, while he was describing the last three Edomite kings. So this author was arguing that yes, the Hyksos were Semitic, however, they were not descendants of Israel. Rather, they were descendants of the kingdom of Idumea, also sometimes referred to as Edomites. With both sources considered, I think it's safe to assume that the Hyksos were not the same as the ancient Israelites. The article from the Torah, the author was very, very adamant about the distinction. I'll leave both links in the description for you to read on your own and come to your own conclusion. Okay, next we're going to get into the rise and fall of Judea, and this is going to teach us a bit about ancient Judaism and Christianity as well. And here's a table of contents. We've got the rise of Judea, the fall of Judea, the Jewish diaspora, early Christianity and the journey of the apostles, a group called the Desert Fathers, Emperor Constantine's conversion, the birth of Catholicism, and Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So first we've got the rise of Judea around the year 1050 BC. And here's a timeline that gives us an idea of what the kingdom of Israel looked like. So we've got ancient Israel, founded around the year 1300 BC, all the way through the fall of Israel to the Romans in 135 AD. Now, this is an interesting period here around this time, between the years 538 BC and 515 BC, which isn't quite listed here, but it would fit right around here. The ancient Judeans were actually exiled by ancient Babylonians. So that is the Second Temple period, where we get books such as the books written by the prophet Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Now, according to a very controversial anthropologist by the name of Robert Sepper, both the Philistines and the Babylonians are descendants of an early Indo-European tribe. So that was one thing when I heard that, I thought it was interesting that they weren't originally from the land of Canaan, but rather they traveled there from an Indo-European region, somewhere north of India. And here are some different ethnic groups that we know existed in ancient Judea. We've got Romans, Egyptians, Cyrenians, Samaritans, Idumeans. I'm going to speak a bit more on the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, as well as other. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is that when people say Jesus was Middle Eastern, that's kind of like saying Pocahontas was American. Technically, you'd be right, but you have to consider the fact that people in that region all those years ago looked drastically different than they do today. For example, today, Caucasian people make up 76.3% of the United States population, according to the United States Census. Whereas back in the early 1600s, the vast majority of people on this continent were indigenous. And the same was true for ancient Judea. Aside from the Roman occupation, the majority of people in ancient Judea during the 1st century CE were of northern and northeast African descent. Now, back on the topic of the Pharisees and Sadducees, this is a direct quote from a 1st century historian and scholar, Flavius Josephus. One interesting thing to note in this quote is about the Pharisees and Sadducees is that, according to Josephus, it would appear as though the Pharisees and Sadducees were people who had converted to the Jewish faith. And he makes the distinction by saying the third sect, who pretends or lives to a severe discipline, are called the Essenes. These last are Jews by birth, meaning that their parents, i.e. their mother or father, actually were of the bloodline of the original people who were under the covenant with Moses and descendants of their progenitor, Israel. And so what does this mean? It means that many of the Pharisees and Sadducees were in fact from places like Samaria, and Idumea. For example, the notorious King Herod, his grandfather was among those forcibly converted to Judaism by John Hyrcanus in the 2nd century BC, and whose historically the Israelites and Idumeans, also known as the Edomites, were always at odds with one another. And according to both the Torah and the Old Testament, both of these groups are of Abrahamic descent, meaning both of them are in fact Semitic people. And just to give a bit more biblical understanding, this all comes from Genesis, specifically chapter 25, verses 24 through 26. And it states that Abraham's son Isaac, he married a woman named Rebekah and gave birth to two twin boys named Esau and Isaac. Esau became the progenitor of the Edomites and Idumeans, and Isaac became the progenitor of the ancient Israelites. Now, verse 23 of this chapter states that these two boys would become two feuding nations, and history seems to have backed this up. In fact, the Edomites even sided with the Babylonians after the destruction of the kingdom of Judah in 586 BC. And next, we're going to talk a bit about the fall of Judea. So, if you're anything like me, when you think of Rome, chances are that you think of a small place in Italy. However, the ancient Roman Empire encompassed all of Western Europe, parts of the Middle East, and nearly all of North Africa as well. Interestingly enough, most of the nations of the former Roman Empire took part in the Atlantic slave trade nearly 1,500 years later. The massive empire is what's responsible for the destruction of Judea. So it wasn't just Israel against a small city-state. It was Israel versus this massive conglomeration of different unified nations coming against them. And here's another thing that I found was interesting. There were Jewish slaves in northern Africa. This is a quote directly from the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, page 453. And according to most accounts, the earliest Jewish settlements in Africa were in places such as Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. Jews had settled along the Upper Nile at Elephantine in Egypt. These communities were augmented by the subsequent arrival of Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. And that was when 30,000 Jewish slaves were settled throughout Carthage by the Roman Emperor Titus. And this is Carthage right here on the tip of northern Africa. And one thing that's important to note, just because there are predominantly lighter-skinned people in the land today does not mean that they are indigenous. Unfortunately, it usually means that the region was a victim of some sort of colonization. And this is the same thing that we've seen in places like Australia, Argentina, the United States, and here in northern Africa as well. Okay, and next we're going to get into the Jewish diaspora. And before I do, I'd like to give a huge thank you to Rabbi Yehuda Tochukwu Ben Shomer. Your research has helped my understanding and gave me some great sources for me to do even more research. So thank you. So let me go ahead and, I was just reading a note here. Okay, so this is a map illustrating the Jewish diaspora. I got it from Reddit. I didn't get it from an encyclopedia. This is just something I saw in a Reddit forum. So one thing is important to note: Jewish people were scattered throughout the Levant, Europe, Asia, and Africa as well. Now, keep in mind that this map includes the people who had converted to Judaism in the 1st century, such as the Samaritans and the Idumeans or Edomites. So this is it's kind of a mixed group. However, they are all practicing Jewish people who had been scattered. Now, one thing that really shocked me were the communities in East Asia and in South India. For example, we have the Khoisan Jews down here in South India, And we have a tribe here in China. Had no idea. Now, if you look here, the red line is the Sephardim or Sephardic Jews. The yellow is the Ashkenazim or Ashkenazi Jews. Blue is the Mizraim, which have gone into places like Yemen, further into places like Afghanistan, and all the way over to China. And this purple line is what's known as the Beta Israel, which are the children of Israel who had gone into Africa after the fall of Judea between the years 70 AD and 135 AD. Now, for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on certain parts of the Levant and Africa mostly. So if you're looking to get a better understanding of the diaspora throughout Europe, you may want to search elsewhere. So the first community that I'm going to talk about are the Abu Yudaya Jews in Uganda. Now, this community in Uganda was founded by a man by the name of Sime Kukungulu in the year of 1919. He was a statesman of the country and began to study and embrace Judaism after he met several European Jews who'd worked for the British. As of February 2002, this community numbered roughly 600. Though there are some who believe that these people descend from the original 12 ancient tribes of Israel, I haven't been able to find any documents or records to support that claim. And this information is from the Jewish Virtual Library, the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, and timesofisrael.com. Now, here's another interesting thing about Ugandan Jewry, and it's the fact that it was once considered as a homeland for European Jews during their persecution around the time of World War II, and a few decades prior to that. So back in 1903, the British colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain offered Theodore Herzl the Guas Ngishu Plateau near Nairobi, Kenya, as a Jewish settlement. Now, Chamberlain and others mistakenly called this region Uganda, hence the name Uganda Proposal, but in reality it was in Kenya. Now, in reality, Herzl never wanted to use Kenya or Uganda as a Jewish homeland, but he was really just happy that the Western powers were willing to negotiate with the Zionist movement. This caused major controversy amongst the Zionists and the white settlers in Kenya. The Zionists were under the impression that by choosing Uganda, they would be abandoning, their home of Zion. And this caused major uproar at the Sixth Zionist Congress in August of 1903. Now, at the same time, the white settlers in East Africa saw this as a threat to what they considered to be their land. However, this never came to pass, and Herzl, along with the Zionist organization, were later given the land of Palestine by the British government under the Balfour Declaration. Now, with all that said, this is still a very interesting piece of history. It's interesting to see that, things could have gone a completely different way, and Israel could have potentially been in East Africa. Now, next we have the Ashanti tribe of Ghana. Now, the Ashanti are the predominant tribe in Ghana, and some believe that their origins trace back to North Africa, more specifically Egypt or Syria. Now, they have many Hebrew customs, and I'm just going to list a few of them here. They have morning baths in the river that are similar to a mitzvah for ritual baths cleansings. They have similar sanitation laws to those of the Torah. They never fought on Saturday, the Sabbath, in the Hebrew understanding. Their calendar started in the fall, much like that of the Jews. Their stool of authority is similar to that of the seed of Moses. An Ashanti mother is separated and considered unclean 8 days after childbirth. And it is on the 8th day that the child is thus named. Now, they also have similar marriage customs. During a marriage, a cup of wine is given to the contracting familial parties, and the drained cup is then smashed under the feet of the groom. And if the Ashanti are in fact Israelite descendants, then this would indicate that they left Israel around the Second Temple period. And this would fit perfectly alongside the Encyclopedia Britannica's origin of Ghana. Now, according to their senior editor, named Amy McKenna, ancient Ghana was created by Jewish or Berber settlers around the year 300 AD in the area west of Timbuktu in modern Mali. Now, this list of similarities goes on, and if you'd like to learn more, there's a book called Hebrewisms of West Africa by Dr. Joseph J. Williams, and it gives much more evidence on this. And here's an example of Ghanaian jewelry. Now, when I lived in Houston, my sister actually took me to the Museum of History and Fine Arts, and I actually got a chance to check these out in person. Now, when I saw them, they reminded me of this thing called the Millennium Puzzle in this anime called Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is about an Egyptian pharaoh who plays a card game. There's more to it, but that's it in a nutshell. And it just seemed like very interesting. You know, sometimes art truly does imitate life. And here's a few more pictures from the museum website. As you can see, it comes from Ghana, West Africa. And here's another one. And that is that. Now, moving on, we've got the Beta Israel, sometimes referred to as the Falasha in Ethiopia. Now, these are the most well-known and well-accepted of all of the tribes that I'm going to mention. And it's safe to assume that they still know their history because they're the only African country that was never colonized by Europe. Once again, they're the most well-known and one of the few, if not the only, group in Africa that's recognized by modern-day Israel. Now, one thing that I'd learned, I had no idea before, is that the word falasha is actually a derogatory term meaning exile. Now, according to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, one popular Ethiopian belief states that the Beta Israel, which is what they call themselves, it states that they're the descendants of Israelite henchmen who had arrived with King Menelik. And King Menelik was the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Now, another belief states that they're the descendants of the lost tribe of Dan. And this was, Dan was one of the original 10 Hebrew tribes, which was exiled by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC. Now, to back this up, back in the late 15th century, a rabbi by the name of David ben Zimra referred to a Jew in Ethiopia as a member of the lost tribe of Dan. Now, there's a few other theories of their origins as well. One states that they're immigrants from Nubia or southern Arabia. Another states that they're an offshoot of Yemenite Jews, which are Jews from Yemen. And then another one says that they were the children of Israel from Egypt who wandered southward. Now, one thing that we cannot deny is their authenticity. They are, in fact, descendants of the original Israelites. And once again, even modern-day Israel acknowledges this. Now, their Jewish practices predate the advent of Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. So, and that means that they've been practicing Judaism even before Catholicism began to make its way through the African continent. Next up, we have the Eritrean Jews, and Eritrea is a country that borders Ethiopia. It's directly north of Ethiopia. They're next door neighbors. And in this photo, we've got the actress by the name of Tiffany Haddish at her bat mitzvah. Now, the first documented Jews came to Eritrea from Yemen in the late 1800s, and a few from Europe in the 1930s on their way to Israel. These people lived relatively peaceful lives in Eritrea until the Eritrean War of Independence that lasted between 1961 to 1991. According to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, virtually all of the remaining Jews left during this conflict. In fact, as of 2006, only one Jew was listed on record as living in Asmara, which is the capital of Eritrea. Now, in regards to their ancient Jewish history, in regards to the ancient Jewish history of this nation, I couldn't find anything substantial, but I would encourage anyone watching to do their research. Now, the fact that Eritrea is so close to Ethiopia I wouldn't be surprised if there were members of the Beta Israel from there as well. Now, another reason why I'm showing you this map is to show you how close East Africa is to the Middle East. Now, right here you can see Eritrea, we have Ethiopia, and Somalia to the south. And right across the Red Sea, near the Gulf of Aden, we have Yemen. Now, these places are so close, and I'm going to give you a better understanding here. So I actually took the time to figure out the distance here. So this is roughly 21.7 miles apart from one another. Now, this is a place called Fagal in Djibouti, and this is just a part of Yemen that extends into the Red Sea here. Now, the average sailboat goes at about 15 knots, which is 17 miles per hour. So with that considered, it would take the average sailboat about 1 hour and 17 minutes to get from Yemen to Eastern Africa. And here we have another tribe, and this is a very interesting tribe to talk about too. They're called the Gadangme tribe, and they're from Ghana, West Africa. And they claim to be descendants of the tribes of Gad and Dan, hence the name Gadangme. It's Gad and Dan put together. Now, according to their oral history, they came from Israel around the 6th century BC through Egypt and Ethiopia. Now, while in Ethiopia, they occupied the Gondar province to the north until they were attacked by the Assyrians. And this forced them further south to Sudan until they began to traverse westward through Niger until they reached West Africa. Culturally, this tribe, they're a patriarchal tribe, meaning that their culture flows through the father. They practice circumcision on the 8th day, and they also have a festival called Homowo Festival, and it has some similarities to Passover as well. Now, the most convincing similarities that I saw were between the language. Now, the Gadangme Heritage and Culture Foundation has compiled a list of words in their language that also exist in the Hebrew language. Now, at the time of me recording this, there are 206 on their website, and I'm going to leave a link to the website in the description if you care to check them out. And feel free to pause if you want to check out any of these words. So we've got another group here, another group here, and another one here. And this is only 123 of them. There's still about 100 more. So next up, we've got the Igbo tribe, also known as my people. This is where my father is an Igbo from Nigeria, West Africa. Now, our origins are still debated in some circles, but one thing that's interesting is that our culture, known as Omenana, it shares many customs with the halakha of the Jews, and this includes 8th-day circumcision and certain dietary traditions. Now, it's worth noting that most of the victims of the Atlantic slave trade are descendants of this tribe as well, and they actually disembarked from a place called the Kingdom of Judah in West Africa. And I'll come back to that later. I've actually got a map to show. Another interesting thing, our former Israeli ambassador by the name of Noam Katz, he strongly believed that Igbos are in fact descendants of ancient Israel. Now, in the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, Remy Alona writes that some Jews migrated to Nigeria from North Africa around the year 500 AD, which would help explain our origins. And he goes on to say that there are 3 known groups: the B'nai Gat, which are said to have been descendants of the tribe of Gad, who was the second son of Jacob; B'nai Zebulon, said to have descended from the tribe of Zebulon, which is the 5th son of Jacob, and Jacob is Israel. He changed his name from Jacob to Israel at some point in his life. And the third group is B'nai Ephraim, who are said to have descended from the tribe of Ephraim. And note that this last tribe that I just mentioned, they actually exist within the Yoruba, not the Igbo. However, they're all in Nigeria, so I just placed them all together for convenience here. Now, in addition to this, some claim to be descendants of other tribes, such as Dan, Judah, Levi, Zebulon, etc. And although modern DNA testing seems to have proven this idea false, there's still many people who disagree, and I'll touch on that later in this presentation. And next up, the Lemba tribe. Now, this tribe has the most thorough evidence of every other tribe aside from the B'nai Israel in Ethiopia. Now, this tribe, they reside mainly in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And as I said before, they have one of the strongest cases for their links to their Jewish origins. And that link would be DNA evidence. So, back in the year 2000, a British historian by the name of Tudor Parfit, which was featured in a Nova documentary, which studied the genetic origins of the Lemba tribe in southern Africa. Now, this tribe has an oral tradition which states that they originate from a Jewish ancestor who left Judea around 2,500 years ago and settled in a place called Senna, which is in modern-day Yemen. Their ancestors later migrated into northeast Africa, namely Ethiopia, and from there they began to intermarry with the local African population. They then traveled further south into places like Zimbabwe and South Africa. Now, at the end of this genetic study, Dr. David Goldstein concluded that many of the members of the Lemba's subclan, named the Buba, B-U-B-A, they have something known as the Cohen modal haplotype. So what does this mean? It means that their oral traditions are valid, and many members of this clan are direct descendants of the Levitical priesthood through their fathers. And here's a photo of the DNA analysis. At the top here we have the Lemba, and down here we have DNA taken from various Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews as well. Now, if you look at them, they're nearly identical. And at the end of this study, Dr. David Goldstein concluded, their oral history it appears to line up with DNA evidence. So what does this show us? It's showing us that not only were they telling the truth, but the fact that they share a common ancestor means that they are in fact related. For example, if you and I have the same great-grandfather, it means that we're related, even if we're distant cousins. Now, this is groundbreaking, and I was shocked when I came across this, that this isn't something that's more well known, even amongst many African circles, as far as I know. Now, next up, we have the Sefwi tribe in Ghana. Now, the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora states that in Western Ghana, the House of Israel community, sorry about that. That was an awkward quote that I had written here. So in Western Ghana, the House of Israel community of Sefwi, we also in Sefwi. So it's two communities, but one tribe of people. We have the Sefwi we also and the Sefwi Sui. And they claim that their Sefwi ancestors are descendants of Jews who migrated south through the Ivory Coast, likely from Timbuktu. And that's straight from the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, page 451. Now, the Sefwi we also are about, it's about a 7-hour drive from Ghana's capital, Accra. And it's the first known traces of modern Judaism in that region date back to the year 1976. Now, back then, a Ghanaian man by the name of Aaron Ahomtre Toakirva, wow, I apologize. He had an intense vision in which he states that he spoke with spirits, which drove him to believe that he and his fellow Ghanaians were in fact descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. And as a result of this vision, he began to see, or I should say, he began to notice many similarities between the Sefwi practices and those of modern Judaism. And those include strict observance of Saturday as the rest day. In fact, those who didn't observe Saturday as a rest day were often punished. They also have strict dietary laws which forbade the consumption of pork, and they also have male circumcision. Now, initially, when he came forward with his vision and began to tell people, folks thought he was crazy, but over time, more and more people began to accept his views as plausible. And next up here, we've got the Tutsi tribe of Rwanda. Now, if you aren't familiar with this man, this is Paul Kagame, who is the 6th and current president of Rwanda. So if you've ever seen the film Hotel Rwanda, then you're familiar with the genocide that this tribe endured. Fortunately, since then, Rwanda has flourished and now boasts having Africa's cleanest and greenest city called Kigali. As far as their origins are concerned, some Tutsis believe themselves to be Jews who came from the land of Kush, which is also known as Ethiopia. Now, interestingly enough, early European explorers assumed that this group must have had some sort of European ancestry due to their unique physical features. And much like the Lemba and the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, some Tutsi claim that their origins are a result of the marriage between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And once again, the Queen of Sheba was a legendary Ethiopian queen who had a child with King Solomon, and that's referenced in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Next up, we have the the Yibir tribe in Somalia. Now, I want to give a huge thank you to TLTW Ministries because I nearly overlooked this population until I came across your video talking about their origins. Now, the name Yibir, it's a transliteration of the word Hebrew. So their name literally means Hebrew, and according to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, this group is in fact looked down upon as descendants of the ancient Israelites. And the rabbit hole goes a bit deeper. According to a report published in 2009 by the Austrian Red Cross, there is some historical merit to the notion that the Iberi have a connection to Jewish or similar religions. What's more, according to Virginia Lilling, the Hebrew idea is not an anti-Semitic invention by others, but was and is maintained by the Iberi themselves. In spite of this, according to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, the subclan doesn't have any knowledge or tradition of Judaism. Keep in mind that this book was published in 2011, so things may have changed since then, so I'm not sure if any new discoveries had been made regarding this tribe. And next we've got another Nigerian tribe called the Yoruba. The Yoruba are the largest tribe in Africa with nearly 40 million people. Within this population, within this tribe's population lies two unique groups: a small Jewish population known as the B'nai Ephraim, meaning the sons of Ephraim, and a subclan known as the Ijiu, which is believed to be a corruption of the word Hebrew and Jew. Now, the latter of these two groups is looked down upon by the rest of the Yoruba for having a lot of similarities to the Igbo tribe. Now, they believe that they originated from a people who were driven from Morocco to Yoruba land by the then Muslim population. They then began to intermarry with the local Yoruba people. This claim seems to be supported by their language, which appears to be a mixture between North African Arabic and the local language. And today, this group is distinct by their observance of the holy days, eighth day naming traditions, and various other Hebrew practices. Now, in spite of all of this, much like some other African tribes, there is still some debate to their claims. Now, next up, we have the Safin Ibrahim in Madagascar, East Africa. So, off the coast of Madagascar is a small island known as Sainte Marie. And residing on this island is a community of black Jews known as the Safin Ibrahim, meaning descendants of Abraham. They have several Hebraic traits, such as counting days from sunset to sunset, observing feast days, kosher slaughter of beef, kindling fires prior to Shabbat and the holy days, and purification rituals of New Year's. With regards to ancient origins, I couldn't find much about this community. Now, there is also another Jewish community in Madagascar as a result of the Holocaust, and according to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, they are members of a group called the Diaspora Jewish Malagasy. In 1940, the Nazis proposed deporting Jews to Madagascar as a solution to what they considered to be the Jewish problem. And this was known as the Madagascar Plan. It was short-lived due to Germany's loss during the Battle of Britain. And as of 2007, there were 40 Jews from this community still living in Madagascar. And next we have the Zakur in Timbuktu, Mali. Now, the country of Mali has a very extensive documented history of Jews in its country. In fact, many modern-day Malians are trying to reconnect with their roots. In 1993, a historian from Timbuktu named Ismail Diadi Haidara, he started an organization called Zakur, which is Hebrew for remember. And this is the Timbuktu Association for Friendship with the Rest of the Jewish World. A new generation wants to return, this is a quote from thejc.com. Quote, a new generation wants to return to their roots and openly identify as Jews. They have taken the Hebrew name Zakur, meaning to remember. And here's another quote from mindspring.com. In the 8th century AD, the Redanites, which were multilingual Jewish traders, settled in Timbuktu and used it as a base from which they could solidify their trade routes through the desert. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Jews fleeing Spanish persecution also settled in Timbuktu. And another thing is very interesting. In 1492, Timbuktu was a safe haven for many Sephardic Jews who were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. And here's a bit more about Ismail Haidara, the founder of Zakur, and this is right here directly from the Library of Congress. So we can thank Ismail for much of Mali's known Jewish history. He continues his family's tradition of scholarship that stretches all the way back more than 11 generations. And it's thanks to him that we have ancient texts such as the Tariq al-Fatash, which gives a detailed history of Sudan and even has records of Jewish merchants. And it goes a bit deeper. Upon doing his own research, he learned that he is he's the descendant of a Moroccan Jewish trader of the Abana family. Now, this revelation caused him to begin interviewing his village elders, and he learned that his family's Jewish identity was preserved for fear of religious persecution. And here's a bit more evidence to help support this. Evidence to help support this became more apparent. Current crypto-Jewish populations in Mali continue to give their babies Jewish names. Some families sign their names with the Star of David. They still sing Hebrew songs, and some only marry amongst themselves, which isn't common amongst the culture that they live amongst. And here's a quote from the article here, published in Kulanu. Ethnic consciousness was revived by an incident in 1963 near the village of Tinderma. A group of fishermen wanted to build a village on the grounds of a former Al-Yahudi cemetery. The Jews rose up in strong opposition and with a new awareness of their identity. Now, in 1993, as a response to continual religious intolerance, Ismail Haidara went on to found the Zakur organization. And one thing that they were very adamant about is that they wanted to assert their Jewish ancestry. Their goal, they wanted it to be made known that they were not trying to convert to modern Judaism, but rather to make the world known, or to make the world understand where they came from. At a meeting in July 1995, the Zakur made their Jewish history officially known, and in 1996, they became a formally established organization. In May of that same year, the Zakur issued a manifesto to the presidents of Mali and Israel, along with several other Jewish communities around the world. Now, this caused major headlines and even made its way to BBC World News. And the following year, in the spring of 1997, the Kulanu organization went on to publish this press release right here, detailing this story. And I'll leave a link to this press release in the description, and feel free to pause it and to read it if you'd like to as well. Now, here's another source to support the Jewish history in Mali. And this is a quote from a Moroccan rabbi by the name of Rabbi Mordecai Abi Sarur, also known as the last rabbi of Timbuktu. And he belonged to this group called I can't recall the name. I believe it was the Radonite, if I'm not mistaken. And let me go ahead and read this quote. And this is according to Rabbi Mordecai. The Dagatun lived in tents and resembled the Berber Tuaregs, among whom they live in language, religion, and general customs. They are fairer in complexion than the generality of African Jews and are still conscious of their origin. And to the right, we have a photo of a Tuareg Berber man here, and this is from Britannica.com. Now, this happened in 1857. He went on a journey to Timbuktu, and then went on to document his travels in a publication known as the Bulletin de la Société de Géographie. Now, so what does this show us? It shows us that the West African nation of Mali and its famous city Timbuktu have historically been a safe haven for Jewish nomads, travelers, and traders alike. And later in this presentation, I'll mention some of the ancient Jewish families who reside in Mali to this day. And next, we're going to deal a bit with early Christianity and the journey of the apostles. Now, after the crucifixion of Christ, his original followers waited until a Jewish holiday known as the Feast of Pentecost. And this was a very, very popular holiday where all of the Jewish communities from around the countries nearby would return to Judea to celebrate. Now, sometime during the celebration, the Book of Acts states that the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit, descended upon the people, and they began to speak in diverse tongues, proclaiming the deeds of God. Interestingly enough, the tongues or languages that these people spoke were languages that the gathered people could understand. This was the first time that this sort of miracle happened, according to the Book of Acts. And this resulted in thousands of new followers. And now, after this, they then went on to share what we call the gospel, which comes from British, and it means good news. And they shared it even to the point of martyrdom. I'm telling you, some of these believers faced some horrific deaths in the different places that they went to spread the teaching. Now, if you're looking for evidence beyond the Bible, there are several. Now, we have well-known historians such as Polycarp, Papias, and Josephus, along with the very fact that early Christianity, that is Christianity before Emperor Constantine, it existed in various places. It existed in the very places that the Bible states, and even the secular world doesn't contest the existence of the apostles. Now, their martyrdom, on the other hand, is something that people seem to debate. Now, I came across this on Quora.com, and I'd like to give a special thank you to Jenny Hawkins for sharing and summarizing this. Now, although there is very little dependable archaeological evidence of the deaths of the apostles, we do have some written accounts which prove to be very probable. Now, the image above is a 481-page PhD thesis written by Sean Jocelyn McDowell of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, in short, he breaks down the probability of the accounts of the apostles who have been martyred, as seen to the right here. And he lists them in order from most probable to least probable. And he starts with Peter as the highest possible probability, followed by Paul, James, and John. And at the very bottom, we see Matthias. Now, this document, it's very, very extensive, and he gives a lot of evidence to support his claim. Now, what does all this have to do with Africa? Well, according to biography.com, Mark the Evangelist, who's where we get the book of Mark in the Bible from, he was born in Cyrene, and Cyrene is modern-day Libya in North Africa. Now, Mark actually went on to found the Church of Alexandria in Egypt around the year 49 AD. And during my college years, I'd always heard that Christianity was something purely perpetuated by Europeans, and I was astounded once I learned about the origins of Mark. His life came to a tragic end, however, when in 68 AD, upon returning to Alexandria, Egypt, the idolaters of the city placed ropes around his neck and dragged him through the streets. Now, according to legend, his relics, meaning his skeletal remains, were given to Pope Paul VI in 1968 AD. And you can read a bit more about Mark the Evangelist on biography.com. And here's another piece of history that I was never taught. The man mentioned in Matthew chapter 27, Luke chapter 23, and Mark chapter 15 was born in North Africa as well. According to these three accounts, this man by the name of Simon was a bystander to Jesus' crucifixion, and he was forced by a Roman soldier to bear the cross of Jesus. So this goes to show that African history, it runs very deep through the fibers of early biblical history. Now, as we've seen with Mark the Evangelist, early Christianity has been in Africa since the days of the apostles, and some of the earliest groups were the Coptic Christians and another group which came a few centuries later known as the Desert Fathers. Now, as I'd stated before, in the year 42 AD, the Apostle Mark established what we know today as the Coptic Orthodox Church. It was founded in Alexandria, Egypt, and it still stands to this day, although some of the original beliefs have changed quite significantly. Now, this Egyptian church is to thank for many Christian traditions such as monasticism, question and answer styled commentary, and even an early writing system that predated Braille, which is brilliant. Now, around the year 451 AD, the Egyptian Christians, known as the Copts, began to have theological disputes with the Greek-speaking Romans, and this led to the church splitting into two branches, the Chalcedonians and the Miaphysites, which consisted of the Copts in Ethiopia, the Copts in Egypt, the Ethiopians, the Eritreans, the Syrians, and other Eastern and African nations all fell into this category. Now, this split led to the persecution of the Miaphysite Coptic Christians. The Byzantines, which were also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, persecuted this group of Christians from the year 451 AD until the Arab conquest in 641 AD. And after that, these Christians were persecuted by various Muslim caliphates, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. Now, fortunately, the Coptic Church is still around today, but as I said before, a lot has changed in practices and beliefs since the early days. Now, another group of early Christians are known as the Desert Fathers, and these were Christian monks who took things to a bit of an extreme. They often journeyed into the desert to meditate, deny themselves food and water, and in some cases would even beat themselves as a means to become closer to God. This population existed alongside the Coptic Church. And next we're going to deal with Constantine. Now, Constantine is a very important figure in the foundation of, or I should say, he's a very important figure surrounding the foundation of the Catholic Church and the shift from original Christianity into the Roman Catholicism that we see today. So, if you've questioned the origins of Christianity for any amount of time, then chances are that someone has pointed you towards Emperor Constantine. Now, many people assume that he created the religion as a means of control and was the first known Christian emperor. But what actually happened? And I'd like to thank Religion for Breakfast for creating this video. It's titled The Conversion of Constantine, What Really Happened. And this man breaks down the history very, very clearly. And here's a quick summary of what he said. So, in the year 312 AD, on the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had this famous vision. Now, according to Constantine's biographer Eusebius, he had a vision of, quote, a cross-shaped trophy formed from light resting above the sun. And attached to it were the words, "By this, conquer." Now, it's worth noting that Constantine has been documented as having thousands of dreams and visions, but this is one of his more famous ones. Now, this symbol that you can see here, this P with the X intersecting it, this became known as the Chi-Rho symbol. And until the end of his life in 337 AD, Constantine continued to combine the teachings of early Christianity with those of the Roman polytheistic beliefs. Hence, the modern church's similarities to the Roman worship of Sol Invictus, which is a Roman solar deity. Also, things such as prayer to saints and other practices that go in direct opposition to Scripture. Now, in spite of this, Constantine's conversion appears to have possibly come from a genuine place. His conversion wasn't an overnight process. It continually evolved until the end of his life, spanning several decades. Now, he'd actually began to return properties to Christians which were confiscated during the Great Persecution of Emperor Diocletian. And in the year 313 AD, he'd sponsored the construction of several churches, such as the Lateran Basilica in Rome. He'd also granted food rations to the Christians of North Africa. Now, all of his pro-Christian policies culminated in something called the Edict of Milan, and this was his decision to finally legalize Christianity within the Roman Empire. Now, prior to this, it was something that was illegal in Rome. And the following year, in 314 AD, he actually went on record writing to Christian bishops and referring to them as his dearest brethren. And even still, many scholars debate whether or not his conversion was purely from his heart or was just a means to further his political control. Personally, I believe it was the latter, especially considering the continual use of Roman sun god imagery and practices. And speaking of sun god worship, also known as solar monotheism, I find it interesting that Egyptian, Indo-European, and Mesoamerican civilizations all had very similar ideology when it came to worshiping the sun. And according to Britannica's definition for sun worship, nearly all of the Roman gods had solar qualities, and both Christ and Mithra acquired the traits of solar deities. In fact, the feast of Sol Invictus, who was again the Roman sun god, was celebrated on December 25th and became known as Christmas. This holiday in reality has nothing to do with the birth of Christ, and it's the direct result of Roman theology being mixed with early true Christianity. The mix between Roman theology and Christianity is also the reason that Jesus is often depicted as a white man with the sun behind his head. Many of the earliest depictions of Christ came directly from those of Roman deities, such as the Roman god Jupiter. Now, the depiction that we see today, which a lot of people attribute to Cesare Borgia, actually began centuries earlier, and we're going to get into that
thanks to Emperor Constantine.
Right here next.
So here's what happened. Okay, so long story short, Constantine was going into a battle, and on the bridge going into the battle, he had a very intense vision. He looked in the sun and he saw what he described as the reflection of himself along with a symbol. Now, when he saw that, he attributed it to the Christian God, but there's still a lot of confusion there, and I'm going to touch on that. So as a result of this vision, it led to the creation of the Roman Catholic Church. So he converted to Christianity, but he still maintained a lot of pagan traditions, namely sun god worship. In that same year, 313 AD, he signed something called the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal within the Roman Empire. Constantine and his successors wanted to unite the Roman Empire, but his church was a mixture of true Christianity and Roman paganism. So it was more of a political move than it was a religious one. He wanted to maintain order within the empire, but he realized that he couldn't quite do away with Christianity. So what did he do? He combined true Christianity with the Roman theology of its time. Excuse me, of his time. And with regards to the Roman Empire, it never truly fell. It more so hid itself within the depths of the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church, as we can see in many of the naming conventions used within the church today. For example, the title Pontifex Maximus was originally attributed to Roman emperors, but now it's used for the Pope. The Latin name literally means bridge builder, and it was given to the head of the Council of the Priests in ancient Rome. So as you can see here, this is a statue of Augustus as Pontifex Maximus, created in 12 BC. And if you go on the Pope's Twitter, you'll see that his handle is actually Pontifex. And according to the Oxford Languages Dictionary, we have two definitions here. In ancient Rome, it was the head of the Principal College of the Priests, and in the Roman Catholic Church, a title of the Pope. So really the same thing. All they've done is kind of shifted the roles of the Roman Emperor and placed it within the jurisdiction of the papacy. Here's something that's even more interesting. So the title of, or I should say the name Catholic, by definition, it means universal or all-encompassing. Now, this is in direct opposition with Orthodox Christianity. And I'd like to cite Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 through 14. It says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." Now, what Matthew was saying was, in order to receive the gifts of the kingdom of heaven, you have to find something known as the narrow gate. Original Christianity was not some broad, all-encompassing thing. Now, yes, the apostles went to different cultures and around the world. However, the idea of an all-encompassing belief system that could, bring in beliefs of other faiths goes in direct opposition of true Christian theology. So, Matthew wasn't alone in this. In fact, many hundred years later, we have a man named Martin Luther, and he's responsible for the Protestant Reformation. So, between the years 313 AD until the death of Constantine, and much later, the Catholic Church continued for a very long time. They had a few crusades, an inquisition, the whole nine. And then one day, a man named Martin Luther, not to be confused with Martin Luther King, he came along and he decided to break away from the church. And he did this in a pretty huge manner. So, this man, Martin Luther, he was born in Eisleben, Germany in 1483. His father owned a successful copper refining business and his father became a town councilor in 1492. That year is going to come up a few times in this presentation. So he was a very studious person, Martin Luther. He received both a baccalaureate and a master's degree in liberal arts. And in 1505, he went on to study law in Latin, Corpus Juris Canonici, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. However, 6 weeks into his studies, he experienced a terrifying thunderstorm in his village that really shook up his whole life plan. The storm he described was so terrible that he vowed to become a monk if he survived. Fortunately, he did, and he made good on his promise. The storm became a catalyst for one of history's greatest agents of change. Now, although his father was greatly disappointed, his legacy more than made up for his abrupt life change. Luther went on to enter a monastery in September 1505, and continued to study theology at Wittenberg, and eventually earned his doctorate. So things went pretty smoothly until one fateful day in Martin Luther's life. He was assigned to represent a German monastery in the Roman court for allegedly violating a papal decree. And a papal decree is an order from the Pope. Now, unfortunately, the Pope had already made up his mind even before Luther had a chance to come defend the monastery's behalf. And this event has such a negative impact on him that he went on record saying that the Pope lacked, and this is a direct quote, the Pope Rome lacked spirituality at the very heart of Western Christendom. It's pretty harsh words. Um, and this was only the beginning of Martin Luther's issues with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the final straw was something called the Indulgences Controversy. In 1517, a Dominican friar, which is a man belonging to the mendicant Roman Catholic order, by the name of John Tetzel, was preaching to people that by purchasing something known as a letter of indulgence, their sins would be forgiven. Now, a letter of indulgence is a document that you'd receive after going to Catholic confession or doing a godly work. It was believed that if you received one of these, you wouldn't have to pay for that specific sin in the afterlife. It was basically a receipt for doing or trying to right your wrongs. And when Martin Luther learned about this, he was so enraged that he wrote his famous 95 Theses, which were 95 arguments against the Roman Catholic Church, and he sent a copy to Tetzel's superiors. He then famously nailed them on the door of the castle church on October 31st of that same year. He argued against the Pope being the supreme authority rather than Scripture, and he also argued that salvation comes as a result of faith in Christ rather than doing good works. And he cited Apostle Paul as a major influence. He really admired the Apostle Paul. And with the help of the printing press, his 95 Theses went viral. He was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church in 1521 AD and gave birth to the Protestant Reformation that same year. And the word Protestant actually comes from the root word to protest. In 1534, he made history yet again by translating the original Hebrew and Greek scriptures into a Bible for the common man known as the Luther Bible. Now, this was almost 100 years before the King James Version. Very interesting. This was monumental. Up until then, Christians in Europe had to rely on high priests to read and interpret the Bible, as it was only written in Latin. And Latin was a language exclusive to the Catholic Church. So it was essentially a means of control, right? You had to go to a high priest to receive your understanding of theology and spirituality. So the layman couldn't read a Bible on his own, or any religious text for that matter, during this time. So Martin Luther King Jr. changed his name? Yes. So he was born as Michael King Jr., believe it or not. And a large part of this story has to do with his father. In the summer of 1934, Michael King Sr., MLK's father, his church sent him on a trip to Rome, Tunisia, Egypt, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem before he eventually set sail to Berlin. There he would attend a Baptist World Alliance meeting that changed his life. That faithful trip to Germany had a profound effect on his father. This was only 1 year before Adolf Hitler became the chancellor, and he witnessed firsthand the rise of the Nazi Germany. He also witnessed the way that the Baptist Alliance fought back against their hatred and mistreatment of the Jewish population. MLK's dad was so moved by this, along with learning about the original Martin Luther, since he was in Germany, that when he returned back to America, he changed his name. And soon after, he changed his son's name as well. And it wasn't until age 28 that MLK Jr. changed the name on his birth certificate from Michael to Martin Luther. And in many ways, MLK was an example of history repeating itself. Side note about Martin Luther King, I just kind of learned while researching him. It turns out his mother and his brother were assassinated as well. Although it's not commonly known. Tragic. I had no idea. So here's a slight tangent regarding the end times. This is, at least for the Christian believers watching this is something that I'd really like to point out. These last few slides, these next few slides are going to deal with eschatology in the end times. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the last days, especially, given all the crazy things that had gone on this year. So I'd like to break that down very, very importantly. So first things first, please stop saying that Jesus can come back at any moment. It goes directly against Scripture. The book of Revelation is in chronological order, and it shows us a series of events that must take place in order for Christ to return. Also, the word rapture does not appear anywhere in the New Testament of the Bible. In Paul's letter to Thessalonians, specifically 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18, he shows us that those who are still alive will be caught up, and this occurs on the day of the Lord. This is one particular day. This is one moment. It's not a rapture followed by years of tribulation and then a second coming. It's one event. And as we continue through these times, keep this verse in your mind and in your spirit. He who endures to the end will be saved. It's not going to be some, day where, you're going to make it out scot-free. According to scripture, many of us are going to go through some very rough times. So get yourself prepared mentally as a believer, because according to the scripture, that's what's supposed to happen. And with regards to a rapture, if one or something like it does occur, it's likely to be a false deception. And if it does happen, then we're going to see the great falling away mentioned in Second Thessalonians chapter 2. A lot of our understanding or belief of the rapture comes from a series of books called Left Behind. It doesn't actually come from scripture itself. Now, in regards to the Antichrist, I've been hearing a lot of people having dreams and different things. Once again, I'd like to cite the book of Revelation. It shows us a series of events that take place leading to this. So, going back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, one of those events leading to the day of the Lord is the tribulation that includes the reign of the Antichrist. So after that, Christ is set to return. So here's one TV show, or I guess I should say Netflix show, that really caught my attention. It's called Messiah. It aired January 1st, 2020, ends on a cliffhanger. There's going to be some spoilers here, so if you plan on watching it, skip ahead so you don't ruin anything for yourself. But I'm shocked that more people did, look at this and think, wow, this is kind of strange. This is like they literally took Revelation and made a TV show out of it. So this man comes, he performs signs and miracles, he brings a false peace, he speaks blasphemies, he's worshipped by the world, and he fits Revelation 13 very well. Now, here's something that a lot of us get wrong. When it comes to the Antichrist, a lot of people are expecting some sort of comic book supervillain. But in reality, he's going to appear much more like a comic book superhero, according to scripture. He's going to be loved, he's going to be adored, he's going to do all these magic signs and wonders, he's going to unite all the world religions, end world hunger, do a bunch of cool things, you know what I mean? But that's where the deception lies. It's going to seem like a good thing at the beginning, but it's going to lead to some very, very evil things in the end. Now here's another show. Stephen King just released a series called The Stand. I just came across the trailer a few days back, and it seems to pick up right where the Messiah show leaves off. The Messiah show leaves off, again, on a cliffhanger, and this show picks up at the beginning of this man who they refer to as a dark man doing a bunch of wicked things. So the premise of this show, it's a post-apocalyptic world where a virus wiped out most of the population. Then an antagonist known as the Dark Man, and it often represented by a wolf, goes around doing some super demonic stuff, flying around, killing people. It's crazy. The trailer's on YouTube if you want to check it out. If you ask me, it's pure predictive programming. This is something that if you watch the trailer, you can be like, okay, yeah, this lines exactly up with scripture. They're putting it out there. You know what I mean? It's very clear when you watch certain things portrayed in Hollywood and in the media that it's not conspiracy theory. There's nothing theoretical about it. There are wicked people in high places, and many of them in their occult beliefs tend to put out not what's the word? It's not prophesying. Rather, it's planning and then letting you know what the plan is. let me continue on here. So I know all this doom and gloom stuff, excuse me, can be very depressing, but I'd encourage you to check out this book called Second Esdras. It was a book that was taken out of the original Bible and placed in a collection known as the Apocrypha. Esdras was a prophet in the Old Testament right around the Second Temple period. And this book takes place during the Hebrew captivity in Babylon. So right around the time of Daniel and Nehemiah. This is when this book is said to have taken place. And so here's the premise. Basically, this prophet, Ezra, he's seeing all these horrible things happen to the Hebrews. And he just starts, praying and asking, like, what was the point? He literally asks God, he's like, why did you make Adam and Eve? Why are we going through this? What's the point? Wouldn't it be better if none of us were ever born? And he's sincerely asking this. And this is the only book that I've come across that actually breaks them down. So he prays and prays, and then God sends him an angel to answer his questions. And this is the part that really made it make sense for me. So these are two particular sections from the book. Your mind has utterly failed you in this world, and do you expect to understand the way of the Most High? And chapter 4, verse 5. But the angel says to Esdras, come, weigh me the weight of fire, or measure me a measure of wind, or call back for me the day that is past. So what the angel is trying to get him to understand is that if he can't understand these foundational things that sound paradoxical about fire, wind, and the days, things that without he couldn't even exist, then the idea of God is beyond not only his, but all humans' comprehension and understanding. The angel's name, by the way, was Uriel. It was an archangel, and the whole goal was to help Ezra to understand that he's limited to human comprehension and understanding. And he explains that, look, if you can't understand this, there's nothing I can say that can let you understand the ways of God. And that he breaks it down in such a way where you don't feel empty. You know what I mean? You don't feel like, well, answer me this. He's so thorough in his questions that by the time you finish reading it, you're like, you know what? I get it. And I get it. I get the fact that I can't understand because I'm limited within this human shell and this human body and understanding. But just having the peace and knowing that the word is true, the thing that's holding us back is that we have to remember that we walk by faith and not by sight. So keep that in mind, because things are going to get rough. And also, this book also helps explain Daniel's vision in the book of Daniel. And it also helps to break down John the Revelator's visions in the book of Revelation. So if you're trying to get a better understanding of eschatology, I highly recommend checking out this book. You can find it free online. I'm just going to repeat myself here. This is another verse. This is what Uriel says to Ezra. He says, your own things that grow up with you, you cannot understand. And how can your frame grasp the way of the Most High, or one already worn out by the corrupt world understood in corruption? So he's saying, look, you live in a fallen world, you're in a human body, you can't get it. So your best bet is to find peace in that understanding. So I like, here's something I like to carry with me. This world may seem outrageous, but reminding myself that I'm limited to my own comprehension and understanding gives me peace. And it's peace in knowing that I'm incapable of understanding why. If you'd like to know more, I'd really recommend checking out the Bible Project on YouTube. They have a video called Ezra Nehemiah, and it chronicles what happened during this prophet's time in the Babylonian captivity. And they have animations. It's really, really good to follow. This is one other verse I like to keep in mind. Isaiah 55:11. It goes, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it. So a lot of times, people use the idea of free will as an explanation for the horrible things that happen in the world. But in reality, it's more of it. Things tend to happen more because God prophesied them, rather than we just have the free will to do whatever we want. Um, and the fact that His word cannot come back void is why these things happen. So yes, we have free will, but we're still limited to what God has said. His word will never come back void. So keep that in mind. We're living. It's not. It may seem like chaos, but it's divinely ordained. No matter how horrible things get. So getting back on track, I'm going to talk a bit about these um, West African empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Essentially the same empire, but different name and at different time periods. And this is where a lot of our ancestors came from, if you're a descendant of the African diaspora. So, how is the Middle East connected to West Africa? So, the Sahara Desert of Africa wasn't always as large as it is today. In fact, its southern border, as you can see right here, was once a lush savanna known as the Sahel Corridor. And it comes from the Arabic word sahil, which means coast or shore. Travelers and merchants alike would use this region to travel from eastern nations, such as Egypt and Ethiopia, to western nations, namely Timbuktu, right here in Mali, West Africa. Um, so do some research on ancient Timbuktu and the rest of Mali. Believe it or not, this region was essentially the Hong Kong of ancient Africa. It was the hub of international trade and commerce. And it was even home to the world-renowned international university known as Sankore. And this is where they taught high-level mathematics, sciences, astronomy, and much, much more. So on the left here, this is a photo of a Sahelian forest along the Bamako-Kayes Road in Mali, West Africa. The trees in the foreground are acacia trees, by the way. And on the right, you can see a 1905 depiction of different ethnic groups in the Sahel. Now, I don't know these ethnic groups by name, but you can see some diversity amongst their dress and some facial features as well. It's a very diverse part of the world. So, the creation of the Middle East. This is an article from the Washington Post titled "How the Middle East Was Invented." So, to give a bit more context, I think it's important to give a bit more background on what we call now the Middle East. Now, believe it or not, the name Middle East is fairly new. It came about in the 1850s from the British as a way to describe this region's relative location in Western Europe. So, if you look here, we've got the Near East, and further over, we've got the Middle East. And if you go further eastward to China, Japan, we have what they refer to as the Far East. So this name, it's not the name of a continent. Rather, it's a way to describe a region's relative location to Europe. In this article, there's a link down here if you want to learn more. It goes into the specifics of, where the name came from and that sort of thing. Now, according to the article, this name was more popularized after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was around the time of the First World War. Prior to that, the people of this area usually just referred to either the name of their nation or the name of their tribe, but the name Middle East was something that came along in the 1800s. It's very new. And while we're on the subject, I want to break down the distance from, from Israel to the rest of Eastern Africa. Now, this is something I pulled up on Google. The distance between these 2 points, this right here being part of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, and this central random part of Israel, it's only 190 kilometers, which is 118 miles apart. Now, if you look at the border, they're literally adjacent. They're actually touching. And this is just to get in your mind how close it is. it's right beside each other. It's not divided by countries. Rather, it's actually connected. So Israel is in Africa? Well, technically, yes. Believe it or not, Israel, Palestine, if you prefer to call it that, is actually a part of what's known as the African Nubian tectonic plate, meaning that although it may not be politically considered a part of the African continent, it is geologically a part of the continent. And that's something that's just geology. This is a, something called the African plate, and Israel is in fact a part of that plate. Now, speaking of Israel, this is an excerpt directly from Britannica.com in an article about the Sudan region of Africa. And according to senior editor Amy McKenna, ancient Ghana was created by Jewish or Berber settlers around 300 CE in the area west of Timbuktu in modern Mali. So, what is a Berber? Well, the word Berber is sort of a blanket term and encompasses many ethnic groups in northern Africa. Here are two main types. The Amazigh, which are of Indo-European descent, mainly from Turkish origin, and the Tuareg people, which are indigenous Berber groups to northern Africa. Now, Amazigh now are the predominant group within the Berber population. However, they're not the original or the sole Berber group, if that makes sense. And here are photos to go along with it. The Tuareg, as you can see here, are the more African-looking group, and the Amazigh are of Turkish origin. Now, both live alongside each other in northern Africa, but just something to keep in mind. If you search Berber, more than likely you're going to see more Amazigh people, but there are Tuareg as well. Back to the Songhai Empire. This is a quote directly from the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora. In Mali, several thousand people in Timbuktu claim some form of Jewish ancestry. Moors and Jews fleeing persecution in Spain migrated south in the 14th century, 1300s, to Timbuktu, which was part of the Songhai Empire during that time. Now, among them was the Kehat family, who founded 3 villages that still exist to this day in Timbuktu. A man by the name of Askia Muhammad came to power in 1492, there's that year again, and forced Jews to convert to Islam or leave. And after this, Judaism became illegal in Mali. So what does this teach us? It teaches us that, 1, there were in fact Jewish people living in West Africa, and 2, there was a forced conversion at the same time of the Spanish Inquisition. This is something I'd never learned in school. It's something that it blew my mind when I read it, and was actually a big part of the inspiration behind me creating this presentation. Now, with regards to this family, the Kehat family, I'm going to break this down. So who were the Kehat family? According to the Jewish Virtual Library, the Kehat were Kohat was the second son of Levi and the grandfather of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So this is a family that traces its lineage all the way back to the grandfather of Moses. And according to the Encyclopedia Biblica on page 2686, the largest and most important of the triple division of the Levites to the Kohathites belonged Aaron, and hence the Kohathites are sometimes subdivided into the children of Aaron the priest and the rest of the children of the Kohath family. They were entrusted with the care of the sanctuary during the wanderings in the wilderness. It cites I believe this is the book of Numbers, if I'm not mistaken. And their cities are placed in Ephraim, Dan, and half Manasseh. The Korahites were also reckoned in this division. So what this is saying is that this group, this family, they actually, more specifically, are of the lineage of Aaron. So Moses' brother was the father of what's known as the Levitical priesthood, and this family are the descendants of that tribe. I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here. I'm going to talk about a man named Mansa Abu Bakr. In the 14th century, there was a ruler of Mali, West Africa, known as Mansa Abu Bakr. Now, this is the predecessor to Mansa Musa, who we now know is the richest man in history, and whose pilgrimage to Mecca was so extravagant that nobody has had one comparable since. In fact, according to Arab historians, he gave away so much gold that it destabilized the Egyptian economy. Now, not much is known about the life of Abu Bakr II, but we do have a second-hand account from a Syrian historian named Al-Umari. Now, according to his account, Al-Umari was told about the legendary voyage that Mansa Abu Bakr um, made and told to Mansa Musa. And the story goes that Abu Bakr sent 200 ships across the Atlantic Ocean to see what was out there. Sometime later, only one ship returned, and the captain of that ship came across a river. Well, this is the account of the captain of the ship that returned. They came across a river with a very strong current that violently pulled the ships along, and the rest of the ships were never seen again. Now, this one particular ship decided to turn back and play it safe. And once he got back to Abu Bakr and told him his account, the Mansa, he prepared 2,000 ships of his own and went out with them to see what was out there. Now, as he prepared to disembark, he made Mansa Musa to take his place. Now, unfortunately, this was the last time that anyone heard from this man. And it's very, very interesting. You know, some still wonder, or I should say, some argue that he actually made his way all the way to the Western world. Although we don't have evidence, we do have evidence of some early West African existence in North America, and I'd like to touch on that next. So as you can see here, this is a man by the name of Dr. Ivan van Sertima. He's the author of a book titled They Came Before Columbus. Now, for years, this man was ridiculed over his assertion that Africans had been traveling to and trading with the early Americans even before Columbus. And something has changed. He doesn't seem so outlandish anymore. Now, this is a recent lecture by a man named Dan von Hoyle, excuse me, in which he gives a thorough breakdown of Dr. Sertima's findings. The name of this video is called Black Before Columbus Came, The African Discovery of America. And he breaks down different botanical evidence and papyrus reed boat evidence. There's a lot of evidence to support the idea that Africans actually did come to the Western world prior to Europe. And it makes a lot more sense when you think about it. For one, Africa is much closer than Western Europe, and it doesn't seem as crazy when you begin to understand the technology and the world as it was in Western Africa pre-colonialism. We weren't just a bunch of people playing around in dirt. That we were living in an advanced international civilization. Okay, now I'm going to get into a little bit of Islam, and these three things that you see before you, the Umayyad, Almoravid, and Almohad, are something called Caliphates. And a caliphate is an Islamic, essentially it's an Islamic empire, more or less. And I'm going to break that down here very importantly. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about Islam as a religion. Now, one thing that's important to note is that not every African Muslim was forcibly converted. A lot of times we hear that the Arab slave trade is the reason why many of us are Muslim, but in fact, some people actually converted on their own. And I'd like to give the example of a man by the name of Bilal ibn Rabah, peace be upon him, who, according to early Islamic literature, actually converted on his own, and his conversion had such a profound impact that he actually was chosen to give the first call to prayer, and as such he became Islam's first muazzin. He was an East African, and he converted. Now, let me see what I've got here. Here we go. So what's incredible about this story is that his piety toward Islam is what caused the Prophet, peace be upon him, to send his close friend Abu Bakr, no relation to the previous Abu Bakr that I mentioned, to help him. Now, this man, Bilal, peace be upon him, was a slave before he converted, but when people learned that he was such a devout Muslim, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, learned about this, he sent his helper to go free him, and they became very close friends. And this man became Islam's first muazzin. Very, very interesting. Now, another part of Islam that a lot of people don't know is that the Kunta tribe, which is where we get the story of Kunta Kinte, whether or not it's a fictional story, I'm not quite sure, but the Kunta tribe is very real. Now, I came across a video that broke down the Kunta's possible Muslim roots, and it goes on to say that this woman by the name of Fatima Firi, who was the founder of Al Quran University, which, by the way, is the oldest university in the world, founded in 859 in Morocco. The legend goes that they actually share a common ancestor. So the Kunta tribe are said to have descended from a Sahaba named Uqba ibn Nafi. That man was a part of the Arab conquest of northern Africa, and he helped to establish the city of Fustat, which is today known as Cairo. This man later migrated into Tunisia and established the city of Kurawin, and one of his descendants was Fatima Fihri. She moved to Morocco to establish her own masjid, which became Al Quran University. Now, if the Kunta's claims of being descendants of Uqba are true, then that would make the Kunta tribe and Fatima Fihri distant relatives. Now, sources to support this. I had a tough time finding anything that actually supported this claim. I came across two different publications, one by Cambridge University and a much older one from University of London. And what they've done is they've broken down the Kunta's claims of being descendants of Uqba. Now, the Kunta people claim to be, the Kunta people's claim is mentioned in the Galawi epistle known as the Risala al-Galawa, Galawiya. Gotta work on my Arabic here. It was written by a man named Sidi Muhammad as a way for the Kunta people to position themselves as the bearers or bringers of Islam to the Sahel region of West Africa. Both of these sources claim that it isn't fully true. Now, again, I'm not incredibly well versed as it comes to this, but according to the Cambridge source, by connecting themselves to historical characters such as Uqba, who brought Islam to Africa, groups like the Kunta were able to make the argument that they too were the bearers of Islam. North African historians and chroniclers had used the story of Uqba to elaborate the beginnings of the relationship between Arab Muslims and the Berbers. In effect, the Kunta picked up on this tradition and extended it to include who they considered to be the blacks, darker Africans. As such, the Kunta were able to situate themselves as the first to bring Islam to West Africa and the first to wage jihad against the local black African infidels. So, the name of this book is called, the book entitled Making Race in the Sahel makes a very stark argument against that of the Kunta. However, I would take this with a grain of salt. It's really just an argument that the Kunta tribe was trying to write itself into Islamic history, but it doesn't seem far-fetched if you ask me. You know, anytime when there's any sort of migration of people, they tend to intermarry. So it doesn't seem impossible. But once again, I'm not an Islamic scholar, nor am I an expert on the Kunta's history. So If you are, or if you're interested, I would encourage you to do your own research to try to find the origin of this story. Now, those things were just to kind of give you an understanding of a little bit more of Islamic history in West Africa. Now, history, it spans hundreds of years. There's much more to it, but that's just more of a starting point. Now, now we're going to jump into the major Islamic caliphates in North Africa, and a period known as the Reconquista in Spain. So, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, many Muslim rulers, known as caliphs, came about. They'd expanded from places like Mecca and Medina all the way across northern Africa and into Western Europe. Now, these empires known as caliphates played a major role in both African and European history. They're also the reason that so many Africans who were enslaved were Muslim a few centuries ago. Now, although I mentioned that some Africans did convert on their own, many of them were forcibly converted. This is history. Now, this time period, known as the Reconquista, lasted from the late 7th century until January of 1492. And once again, that's the same year that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. By the way, the reason that Spanish and Arabic have so many similarities in their languages is because Spain was under Islamic rule for roughly 700 years. To put that into context, that's about 3 times longer than the United States has been a country. Note, as we get into this section, some of my dates may be off. I found a lot of conflicting information surrounding it, so again, take this with a pinch of salt. So first up, we have what's known as the Umayyad Caliphate. And this was the first one, which spanned all the way from India across Africa and into Spain. It was established by a man named Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. It was headquartered or based in Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. Now, this was the 7th largest empire in world history, and thanks to it, it turned Spain into the most advanced country in Europe during its time. In the year 613 AD, the Visigoths, who were a Germanic people who were ruling Spain, they came and they'd forced the Jewish population to convert to Catholicism or leave. And nearly a century later, in the year 694 AD, any Jewish person who failed to convert was enslaved. Now, in the year 711 AD, when the Muslim Moors began to take over Spain from the Visigoths, they not only released the Jewish slaves, but they permitted them to organize their own communities. And this is straight from the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora. Now, believe it or not, Jews and Christians lived in peace amongst the Muslim rulers of this caliphate, and many of them had high-ranking positions within the empire. And this, along with future caliphates, brought along many advances to Europe, such as surgery, astronomy, high-level mathematics, and much, much more were taught to Europeans by these Muslims, both Arab and Africans alike. In fact, Islamic scholars are where we get a lot of our words, such as algebra, alcohol, algorithm, alkaline. The prefix al comes from the Arabic word for God, Allah. Now, the Umayyad Empire began to fall apart around the year 717 AD due to it being spread too thin. Happens all the time with just about every empire. And eventually it fell in the year 750 AD in Syria. Now, despite the collapse in Syria, the empire would continue to thrive for a few more centuries in Spain until the Berber Revolt in the year 1010 AD. Now, this led to a series of conflicts which concluded with the First Crusade. And next up, we have what was known as the Almoravid Caliphate. Now, this was founded by a North African Berber. This was founded by North African Berbers who were united under Sunni Islam. Now, the name Almoravid means those who are united in the cause of God. This empire was comprised of mostly Berbers, although there were some Arabs as well. And their goal was to return Islamic piety back to the Maghreb, which was the northwest region of Africa, and parts of Spain as well. Now, the man on the right is named General Abu Bakr ibn Umar ibn Ibrahim ibn Turgut. So whenever you see the word ibn, IBN, that just means son of. Similar to the word bar, whenever you see a Jewish name with bar, it means son of. Now, this man was an Almoravid general from 1056 until his death in 1087 AD. He was a chieftain of the Lamtuna Berber clan, and he and his brother, named Yahya ibn Umar al-Lamtuni, and the Arab Islamic scholar Abdullah ibn Yassin are responsible for this Almoravid movement. So it's really kicked off by these three men. In the year 1090, they took control over Al-Andalus, which is modern-day Spain. And their goal of going against the Spanish Catholic powers, their goal was to go against the Spanish Catholic powers of the time. Now, this caliphate helped the Islamic world to regain Spain, most of Morocco, and Algeria. Now, last but not least, we have the Almohad Caliphate. Almohad means those who affirm the unity of God, and it loosely translates into monotheist. Now, this one was established by an African Berber named Muhammad ibn Tamart. Now, this is a very interesting person. He was a devout Muslim, and he made it his mission to bring religious purity back to the Maghreb, which once again is this region of northwest Africa, parts of Spain as well, across the Iberian Peninsula. Now, he felt as though the Almoravids, which were the caliphate before this one, he felt that they'd been slacking off and he could do a much better job at getting things back on track. His Reformation centered around a strict concept of the unity of God, known as Tawhid. Things got much more serious in the year 1121 when Tamart proclaimed himself to be Al-Mahdi. Now, this loosely translates into the rightly divided one, and it's supposed to be a messianic figure who will return at the end times to rid the world of evil. It's similar to the Christian understanding of the second coming of Christ, but with many key differences. For instance, it's believed that Al-Mahdi will return before Dajjal, who is the Antichrist. But this is in complete opposition, this is the complete opposite order of Christian eschatology, where Christians believe that the Antichrist comes followed by the second coming of Christ. The understanding of Al-Mahdi is that he returns first, and then the Antichrist returns next. Now, this man, he also began to war against the Almoravids the same year. He eventually defeated them in 1147, and he made Marrakech, Morocco, into the Almohad capital. Now, from there, he went on to conquer Spain. And one thing to note, this caliphate was a bit more brutal than its predecessors. Now, according to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, in the 12th century, this caliphate prohibited the practice of Judaism in Morocco, and it forced followers to convert. About 80 years later, in the year 1212 AD, the Almohads faced a shattering defeat against the Catholic coalition in Spain. Now, this caused the caliphate to both shrink and to retreat further south, further towards Africa. This caliphate really began to decline around the year 1248, when various African tribes began to break off and remove themselves from the Almohad movement. And they were really on their last legs around this year. And after this, the caliphate eventually fell in the year 1269 AD. Now, when this happened, the only Islamic kingdom that remained in Spain was the Kingdom of Granada. And this kingdom kept fighting, and they held on for a long time, but eventually they were defeated too in the year, you guessed it, 1492. Now, we'll come back to this very shortly. All right. Now here we go. 1492, Columbus Zoo. Don't ask me why I wrote this. I don't know, I thought it was going to be funny. Anyway, whenever you hear this year, you immediately think about Christopher Columbus. If you were, if you grew up in a Western educational system. However, there were several other major people and events during this year and around this time. Now, major events and people circa 1492. We have the defeat of the Moors, the Spanish Inquisition. We have Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand II, Cesare Borgia, who many consider to be the white Jesus. We'll touch on that. Leonardo da Vinci and the Last Supper. He began painting that painting around this time. Askia Muhammad in West Africa, the Songhai Empire, and lastly, Christopher Columbus. And these are just the topics that we're going to focus on in this section here. Now, this is a quote Mr. George told me when we spoke. He said, Europe emerged from the Dark Ages only to put the rest of the world into the Dark Ages. And this was the height of the Renaissance period. Now, after the Middle Ages, Western Europe experienced a major growth in art, science, mathematics, and more. Now, a lot of these findings can be attributed to the conquest of the Islamic Caliphates, and many people believe that actually fueled the Italian Renaissance and helped Europe to become what it became in the 1400s. Now, unfortunately, the nations that these European powers came into contact with took a very different turn. So, coming right back to the Islamic kingdoms. Now, after the fall of the Almohad Caliphate, this was the last standing Muslim kingdom, and it was known as the Emirate of Grenada, also known as the Kingdom of Grenada. And as you can see, it was located on the southernmost tip of Spain. We have the Mediterranean Sea down here, and over here you can see Morocco, almost touching Spain. They're super close. Now, in the year 1482, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain declared war on this Muslim kingdom. The battle lasted for 10 years and ended with the Moorish defeat. On January 2nd, 1492, King Boabdil surrendered Grenada to the Spanish forces, and soon after this, Spain began to force Muslims and Jews to either choose to convert to Catholicism or face exile or persecution. And this takes us right into the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the Spanish Inquisition was a court of justice system meant to fight against heresy within Spain and its colonies. They'd hold trials to see whether people were guilty of blasphemy, heresy, witchcraft, things like that. Now, over its roughly 300-year time span, the Spanish Inquisition was responsible for some 32,000 executions, which is relatively minimal compared to other inquisitions around this time. Now, in 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand issued an edict which forced Jews to convert to Catholicism, leave, or face persecution. And the same year, as a result of the Grenada War, the Spanish forces defeated the Moors, and Spain switched from a Muslim and Jewish ruled country into a largely Catholic one that we see to this day. Now, 10 years later, in the year 1502, a Spanish cardinal named Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros began to persecute Muslim Moors in much the same way. Now, many Sephardic Jews and Moorish Muslims alike began to make their way south across the Iberian Peninsula into West Africa. In fact, many went all the way down into Mali, West Africa. Which brings us to Askia Muhammad. Now, Askia Muhammad I was a powerful West African statesman and military leader. Although his origins are still debated, most people believe that he was born to a Senegalese family in Gao. He's most known for taking over the throne of the West African Songhai Empire. Now, one thing that many people don't know is that during that same year, in 1492, much like the Inquisition in Spain, he forced Jews in the empire which again, modern day Mali, to either convert to Islam or leave. Now, history shows us that many of them did convert for fear of persecution, and they kept their Jewish ancestry hidden until the late 1900s when things began to become uncovered. And this is a quote directly from Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora. And it goes as follows. In Mali, several thousand people in Timbuktu claim some form of Jewish ancestry. Moors and Jews fleeing persecution in Spain migrated south in the 14th century to Timbuktu, which was part of the Songhai Empire. Among them was the Kahat family, which we spoke about before, who founded 3 villages that still exist near Timbuktu to this day. Now, get this. Askia Muhammad came to power in 1492 and forced Jews to convert to Islam or leave. And after this, Judaism became illegal in Mali, West Africa. All right, now it's getting interesting. Cesare Borgia, right here, he's actually, if you're a gamer, check out Assassin's Creed. I think this is from Brotherhood. He's actually one of the bad guys that you have to fight in the game. It's pretty fun. Now, this guy, Cesare Borgia, he was son of Pope Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia. He was the inspiration for Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, which was a book about a military leader, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken. I've never read the book, but if I remember correctly, it was about a military leader. Feel free to fact check me in the comments if I got that wrong. Now, Cesare was a master of both politics and war, and he even ran the papal army. Yeah, you heard that right. This man was in charge of the Pope's army in 1499. He employed Leonardo da Vinci as his military architect and engineer. And da Vinci famously made, tanks, which were oftentimes didn't work, but apparently that was deliberate. Da Vinci didn't really want to create war machines, but you don't really have a choice, when a military leader comes and asks you to make some things for him. Now, it's highly likely that he knew Christopher Columbus personally, considering his high role in the papacy, and the Pope's role in Columbus's voyages, which we're going to touch on later in this presentation. Now, some believe that this is where we get the image of our modern depictions of Jesus, but we have to go back a bit further for that. Now, the earliest depictions of Jesus appear around the year 200 AD, the oldest being called Alexamenos Graphito, excuse my horrible Greek, which loosely translates into Alexamenos worships his God. This was actually meant as an insult to early Christians. This isn't a meme. This is actually like a depiction that they found, and this is what it looked like. So if you see here, it's a man with a donkey head being crucified. Now, both the donkey head and the crucifixion were meant to be insults to the early Christians. Now, later depictions were found toward the end of the 3rd century, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this one here on the right side of your screen, this was found in an early Syrian church, and it was found in the baptistry section, the part of the church where people would be baptized. Now, according to BibleOdyssey.com, this is actually depicting Jesus raising his friend Lazarus from the dead. This is a before and after, and it reads from right to left. We see Jesus here, Lazarus laying dead, and then Lazarus carrying his bed. Now, as you can see here, Jesus, he neither resembles a Roman god nor has a beard. He's a very plain looking person, as you can see here. Now, this is one of the earliest depictions of Jesus as a philosopher. In this depiction, we see Jesus wearing the robe of a Roman senator. And around this time, it was very common for early Roman and Greek Christians to depict him as a contemporary philosopher. In fact, this painting closely mirrors a mosaic of Socrates that was found in a Syrian villa. As far as where this is from, this is a 3rd century Roman catacomb depiction that was created in the late 200s AD. And these are among the earliest depictions of Jesus as a god. Um, so early artists around the second and third centuries depicted Jesus in the image of gods of their culture. The early paintings weren't based on first-hand accounts, but rather were people's attempts at expressing him within the context of their culture. They're more of projections rather than they are depictions. Now, it's worth noting that these depictions of Jesus as a Roman or Greek god appear in European countries or colonies um, almost exclusively. Um, such as Rome, Greece, and 6th century Egypt. If you look at the photo here in the middle, this is called the Apse mosaic, and it's considered one of the earliest depictions of Jesus as a Greco-Roman god figure. And it went on to inspire many of the depictions that we see today, such as this one to the right, which came later. Now, this Apse mosaic was made, many of these depictions were made in the image of ancient gods such as Jupiter, Serapis, Neptune, etc. The long hair, the beard, and the throne were all meant to, they were symbols of divinity. Now, it's worth noting that other nations outside of the scope of European influence, such as Ethiopia, often had much different depictions of Christ. So, if you worship the image of this so-called white Jesus Christ figure, I would encourage you to repent and reconsider, because it literally traces back to a a Greco-Egyptian sun god, not the Son of Man. And this photo here is of the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. Is an Egyptian deity with Greek influence. And as you can see, this is in chronological order from about 100 AD all the way up to sometime around 548 and 565 AD. And these were all well before Cesare Borgia. Now, if you'd like to learn more, check out this video by Religion for Breakfast. It gives a very, very thorough, full breakdown of this history, and I actually got most of this information from this video here. All right, and speaking of Jesus depictions, the famous painter and inventor Leonardo da Vinci began his painting of the Last Supper sometime around the year 1492. And last but not least, we've got the man, the myth, the murderer, Christopher Columbus. Now, with the help of Pope Alexander VI, which once again was Cesare Borgia's dad, Columbus had the support of the Spanish government in his endeavors. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Doctrine of Discovery, and this gave Spain the exclusive rights to the land west of the Cape Verde Islands in West Africa. So everything from the Atlantic west, the Pope considered to be the property of Spain. Now, this doctrine stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by so-called Christian rulers. So, yeah, you heard that right. The Roman Catholic Church played a major role in the destruction of the native inhabitants of the New World. Now, I'm going to keep things brief and break down some myths and explain some of the history surrounding Christopher Columbus. Number one, he didn't discover America. 2, he never stepped foot on North American soil. 3, he was a known pedophile and child trafficker. 4, he's responsible for the death of millions of innocent people. And 5, we were lied to in school about this person, and we should never have made a holiday commemorating him. And this is a famous quote straight from Christopher Columbus. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spares and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them. For I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate all and make them do whatever we want. And that's just one. There's several other quotes out there. If you want to learn more about what he said, feel free to look them up. All right. 1441, the beginnings of the slave trade. So it's important to note that the Atlantic slave trade wasn't an abrupt moment in history. It was a slow, gradual process which eventually became a large corporate enterprise. And the following are a few key dates which led to the beginnings of sub Saharan Africans being traded as slaves into the Americas. So, the earliest examples of West Africans being sold by Western Europeans began around the year 1441. As the Muslim powers began to fall in Spain and Portugal, the papacy began to fill that power vacuum. They had laws which were specific about how they were to treat Jews, Muslims, and Christians. However, the laws were either vague or non-existent in regards to people who didn't fall into those categories. And once the Portuguese began to enslave West Africans and bring them back to Portugal, it caused a lot of legal and philosophical debates. To resolve this, Pope Nicholas V issued a series of papal bulls, which are just decrees by the Pope, that would give the Portuguese legal rights to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. So yes, the Pope gave the green light to enslave West Africans in the year 1441. Excuse me, I have my dates wrong. I'm going to go ahead and read this quote here. 15th century Iberian legal traditions regulated Christians' treatment of Jews, Muslims, and other Christians. In contrast, the juridical status of people who did not fit these categories were more ambiguous. Legal and philosophical arguments to address this issue began to evolve during the second half of the 15th century. Once Portuguese mariners began to return to Iberia with captives acquired in West Africa and West Central Africa. Notably, the treatment of black Gentiles was addressed in 1452 and 1455, when Pope Nicholas V issued a series of papal bulls that granted Portugal the right to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. I misspoke when I said 1441. This was addressed in 1452 and 1455. Here's another quote. This is a direct quote from the Pope's mandate to the Portuguese king, Alfonso V, in regards to the enslavement of West Africans. Quote, the Pope issued a mandate to the Portuguese king, Alfonso V, and instructed him to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. End quote. It's also worth noting that in the centuries following this, slave catchers no longer limited slavery to only those who they considered to be pagans. This was just how things began in the mid to late 1400s. And this is a prime example of a person who was enslaved in the Atlantic slave trade, who the Catholic Church would not consider to be a pagan. This man, Omar ibn Said, is a prime example. He was born in Senegal, West Africa, and Omar was a devout Muslim and a brilliant Islamic scholar. He studied under his brother, Sheikh Mohammed Said, as well as two other religious leaders for 25 years. One day, a large army attacked his town, killing many people and capturing others. He was then taken and sold across the Atlantic Ocean to a man in Fayetteville, North Carolina. There he was treated with such cruelty that he tried to run away. He was captured and sent to jail for 16 days, where he famously began to write in Arabic on the walls. This astounded many of the white people in town, and he was eventually taken to live with the governor of North Carolina. There he was forcibly converted to Christianity and wrote many of his now famous works, including his autobiography. And this is directly from the Library of Congress. You can read more about some of his writings. Very, very interesting. 1502. Juan de Cordoba of Seville became the first merchant we can identify to send an African slave to the New World. Cordoba, like many other merchants, is permitted by the Spanish authorities to send only one slave. Others send 2 or 3. Now,
this is a touchy subject, but it's a piece of history that we need to address. European Jews did play a major role in the Atlantic slave trade. More specifically, Sephardim from Portugal, they were considered indispensable to the Dutch authorities of Brazil. Many of them were called conversos or new Christians, as they had converted to Catholicism in order to avoid persecution in their home countries of Portugal and Spain. According to the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora, almost all of the Sephardim in Brazil at this time were involved in the sugar trade. And these are two quotes from the Encyclopedia of the Jewish Diaspora. Quote, the Sephardim were instrumental in founding the newly formed Portuguese colony in the Americas, even if they could not disclose their true identity for at least a century. Almost all of them were involved in the cultivation of sugarcane in Brazil, as well as the rest of the Americas, mainly the Caribbean area. From Madeira and in 1542, from Sao Tome and Principe, Jews and New Christians introduced sugarcane and engenhos, and that is, excuse me, sugar plantations and mills to Brazil and thence to the New World, end quote. And here's another quote. Since their arrival, then, excuse me, since their arrival then, the Jewish population, almost all Sephardim of Portuguese origin, became indispensable to the Dutch authorities. The fact that they knew the Portuguese language and culture made them key elements for the economic prosperity of the young Dutch colony in Brazil, mainly in the production and export of sugar products. The slave trade, strictly tied to the cultivation and production of sugarcane, was in fact one of the reasons the Jews were welcomed or tolerated by the Dutch colonial authorities. For example, given their wealth, the Jews were able to sell African slaves on credit to other colonists, end quote. Now, keep in mind that the majority of Africans were in fact sent to Brazil. 35% of enslaved Africans were sent there, more specifically, and only 4.4% were sent to North America and the United States. Therefore, the sugar plantations made for the majority of our bondage and suffering in the Western world. Now, this does not in any way mean that many European Jews are not in fact Hebrew descendants, as some people try to claim. As we've seen with the DNA evidence with the Lemba, the Sephardim, the Mizrahi, and the Ashkenazim, these tribes do share a common ancestor. So they're not. They do in fact come from ancient Israel. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that their involvement within the Atlantic slave trade was literally described as indispensable to the Dutch authorities. Now, I like to compare this to the story of Joseph and his brothers selling him into slavery in the Old Testament. So not only were he and his brothers Israelites, but they were literally the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And in spite of the horrible things that Joseph went through, it was ultimately a part of a much larger biblical prophecy. So once again, I bring up Isaiah 55:11. Many horrible things that happen aren't just because of free will, but many things are destined to happen as part of a much larger plan. And here are a few key events that took place in the year 1555. The Portuguese sailor Fernão de Oliveira in Arte de Guerra no Mar, the Art of Sea at War, excuse my pronunciation there, he denounced the slave trade as an evil trade. The book anticipates many of the arguments made by abolitionists in the 18th and 19th centuries. So just to kind of sum this up, this man wrote a book called The Art of War at Sea and vehemently denounced the slave trade and called it evil. The same year, Queen Mary of England, under pressures from the Spanish, forbids English involvement in Guinea. In July, a small group of Africans from Shama, which is modern-day Ghana, who were described as slaves, are brought to London by John Locke, a London merchant hoping to break into the African trade. And November 10th of that year, a group of Norman and Breton sailors, under the command of Nicolas de Villegagnon, found the first French colony in South America. The settlement close to modern-day Rio de Janeiro in Brazil is named La France Antarctique. All right. And this would bring us to the year 1619, when we actually touched the North American shores. So keep this slide in mind. We're going to circle back to this topic in the next few slides. The year 1619 was very important. So this is considered the starting point of the Atlantic slave trade in the United States. A group of slaves landed in Virginia. Excuse me. Okay, more specifically, in August of 1619, a ship of West African slaves landed in a port of Virginia. I can't remember the exact city, but I believe that I have it written here in the coming slides. Now, here you can see a collection of names from Emory University's Slave Voyages database. During this time period, which is the 1800s, it was very common for Jewish people to have biblical names. And according to Mr. Halviver, who I spoke to a while back, now, although he doesn't believe that West African descendants are from ancient Israel, I still think that this is a very notable coincidence. Now, keep in mind that we're missing about 200 years of slave logs dating back to the early 1500s. This log only begins, I believe, around the year 1819, if I'm not mistaken. Now, there are several other names containing Yah, aside from this Yahweh. However, I could not verify whether or not they were of Hebrew origin. If you're familiar with the Hebrew language and the Hebrew names, I would encourage you to check out the slave log via slavevoyages.org. And these are just a few of the names here. So I'll start with Abraham, and Abraham is the French form of the name Abraham. Excuse me, this is the French writing of the Hebrew name Abraham. We also have David, Yahweh, as I said before, Ezra, Levi, as in the tribe of Levi. We have Sarah, several different Sarahs. Although the name Sarah is also used in Islam for many women too. We have Adel, and one thing to note about this name, it actually means God is eternal in Hebrew. And in 2013, it was considered one of the top, it was named one of the top 10 names in Israel, according to the IsraelNationsNews.com. We also have Moses, Moshe, which is the Hebrew name for Moses, and Noah as well. So I'm going to touch a bit more on the name Yahweh for the name of God, according to the Hebrew understanding. So in this video, Dr. Michael Heiser discusses the much debated spelling and pronunciation of what's considered the Tetragrammaton, which is this right here. He alludes to the writings of Frank Moore Cross. So this is something that some people do debate. Some people, or I should say, the common understanding is that the spelling for Yahweh, Yahweh, and Dr. Michael Heiser explains the difference between the two. Now, the thing that's tricky about the Tetragrammaton is that it technically is just 4 letters, YHWH, and people have placed vowels in between in order to try to give a pronunciation to it. Now, again, this is something that I believe is very, very, if this were to be a coincidence, this is one heck of a coincidence. It's quite literally 1 letter off. Very interesting. So in this slide here, I'd like to give a shout out to Ishan Burgundy. I had no idea that this map was available on the Library of Congress before seeing his presentation on YouTube here. So in the year 1747, a Welsh map engraver named Emmanuel Bowen created this map of Western Africa, which was then known as Negroland, meaning land of the blacks. Interestingly enough, this is what Kemet roughly translates into as well. Kemet is Egypt, as I referenced before in the earlier part of this presentation. Um, this man, he was the royal map maker of both King George II of Britain and Louis XV of France. Now, if you direct your attention to this region right here, you'll see a place on the coast called the Kingdom of Judah. And I find it very, very strange that literally millions of people were enslaved from this very place. This is actually the slave coast, coincidentally or not, named the Kingdom of Judah. Now, Ehav, he pointed out to me that if this were, let's say, truly an ancient or lost Hebrew kingdom, then why wasn't it named Yehuda, for example? And it came to the realization that, well, this is an Anglicanized map. It's written in English, so it's quite possible that they may have just transliterated the name. Now, I don't have any proof to substantiate that, but I believe there's a strong possibility there. Just something to think about. Okay, and the 1619 Project. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the 1619 Project is an initiative from the New York Times that's hoping to shine some light on the contributions of enslaved Africans. So here was the date, August 20th, 1619. This is the town. I couldn't think of it. It was on the tip of my tongue. So on August 20th, 1619, a ship by the name of San Juan Bautista landed in a port in Jamestown, Virginia. And this is what many of us regard as the beginning of our 400-year bondage in North America. And this is an excerpt from the New York Times magazine. In August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the English colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it's finally time to tell our story truthfully. And I'd like to draw a few parallels to a book in both the Old Testament and the Torah as well, called Deuteronomy. Now, this book takes place after the events of Exodus. This is after the ancient Israelites had been freed from the bondage in ancient Egypt. And to put this in a bit of context, the story goes that God made a covenant or agreement between himself, Moses, and the other Israelites. If they keep the covenant, they'll receive the blessings listed in the previous chapters leading up to chapter 28. However, if they break the covenant, which they did, they would have to deal with a series of curses, namely being sold into slavery by ship for 400 years. And that's alluded to in the book of Acts, chapter 7, verse 6. I'd also like to note that in earlier translations, it used the name Mizraim instead of Egypt. And according to Hitchcock's Bible Names Dictionary, Mizraim translates into tribulations. Now, the chapter goes into great detail about the perils of this sort of slavery, and it mirrors the Atlantic slave trade to a T. I'm telling you, the curses of Deuteronomy 28 read very similar to the Willie Lynch letter. If you ever get a chance to read that, it's very short, but read them side by side. You'll notice a lot of eerie similarities. Now, while we're on the subject, I'd like to touch on a lie that many evangelical and other churches perpetuated all throughout American history, and that is the idea of the curse of Ham, or Ham. And this was used throughout the United States as justification for the mistreatment and enslavement of African slaves in the country. So this curse was based on Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, where Noah curses his son Ham for uncovering his nakedness. Now, there are two major problems with the idea that this curse somehow fell on sub-Saharan Africans, some thousands of years later. Number one, Noah placed the curse upon Ham's son Canaan, and according to the Zondervan Bible Dictionary, sub-Saharan Africans, which are referenced here as Negroes, are not descendants of Canaan or his father Ham. And I'll read the dictionary definition here. For Ham, the youngest son of Noah, born probably about 96 years before the flood, and one of the 8 persons to live through the flood. He became the progenitor for the dark races, not the Negroes, but the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites. So the theory that we were descended from Ham's son Canaan and therefore cursed is completely untrue. And I hope people aren't still teaching it, but believe it or not, this is something that was taught vehemently in churches all throughout North America. And another interesting 400-year anniversary just passed, and that was Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock was the landing place of the Pilgrims. And unlike most of the founding fathers and the conquistadors in South America, many of the people on the Mayflower were in fact true Christians. Now, the founding fathers, although many people believe that they were, they themselves don't proclaim to be that. Many of them were deists. And the deists, they believe in a deity. However, they don't believe in the Judeo-Christian idea of that particular supreme being. Now, when we're taught that these people came in search of religious freedom, that's true. However, the freedom that they were searching for isn't exactly what you'd think. Many of the nation's founding fathers sought freedom to delve into the occult, which in many parts of Western Europe had been outlawed. Now, many people on the Mayflower, on the other hand, they were in fact looking for freedom from the Church of England, if I'm not mistaken. But the people on the ship were searching for the freedom to practice Christianity, whereas many of the early settlers and founding fathers, more often than not, were searching for freedom to practice the occult. So this is something interesting that I came across. So there's a legend that a black man actually settled with the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. The legend says that a blackamoor named Abraham Pierce settled in Plymouth Rock in 1623. And this was 3 years after the first settlers arrived on the Mayflower. Now, I'd like to note it's contested whether or not Abraham Pierce had a black father. However, people are still unsure of his mother's origins. According to Brad Pierce, no relation, who was a radiologist from Little Rock, Arkansas, who reviewed the DNA test of Abraham's descendants, his father was likely of Scandinavian descent. However, as I'd stated before, his mother's origins were never tested, and it does not specify why. Now, here's another person. Though this story is also contested in some circles, there's another legend of another black man named Juan, or John Pedro, who the Pilgrims took in that same year. And according to historian and author James Baker, he left Plymouth via the ship named Swan, sometime around late June 1623. Now, here's a strange coincidence. If you've been paying attention to the news, then you probably saw something about this thing called the Great Conjunction, which was a celestial event involving the planet Jupiter and the planet Saturn appearing to overlap in the night sky. Now, these are fairly common. They occur roughly every 20 years. However, this is the last notably visible one that occurred in nearly 400 years. I believe the closest one was 800 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. You'll have to fact check that, but the last significant one happened in July 16th of 1623, which is the same time, roughly, of the time of the alleged Black Pilgrim. Now, this is also very strange that it took place on the winter solstice. That makes it even more rare. Now, according to scripture, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and that's from Luke chapter 21, verses 25 through 26. Again, I don't know if I said this yet, but I don't believe in coincidences. I really believe that a lot of these things are divinely orchestrated. Now, ultimately, we'll have to see where things go within the next few years, but I'd begin to pay more attention to the things going on. We've had a lot of solar eclipses. Uh, there was a buck moon this year. A lot of strange things going on. So no disrespect with this meme. I just thought it was funny. For the record, I just wanted to say I don't follow astrology, but I do believe what Genesis says about constellations being meant for signs, seasons, and years. Um, Now, remember uh, you may have heard the story of the three wise men, right? Uh, well, the scripture never says that there were three wise men. It said that they brought three gifts. However, it doesn't specify the number of people who were there. Um, and the reason that I bring those people up is because some astronomers suggest that the star that occurred that the wise men followed to the newborn Jesus was actually two bright objects in conjunction with one another. And this is a prime example in scripture of celestial bodies being used for signs. So again, when things begin to line up in the stars, everything's not random, everything's not coincidental. A lot of times things happen for a deliberate purpose. So this is a slight tangent, doesn't have very much to do with the presentation, but it was something I came across while I was working on it. Um, if you'd like to learn more about the occult origins of the founding fathers, check out this video. I'm going to leave a link to it. This channel, they are very, very thorough, and they've done a lot of digging into the history of the founding fathers in the United States history. And around this mark, 30 minutes and 53 seconds, they talk about something interesting called the Osiris Rising Ritual. And it's very interesting. I'm not going to spoil it, but check it out if you're interested. Very, very interesting stuff. All right, so we're coming up on the 1900s. We're almost there. So throughout doing a bit more research, I began to learn a lot more about Nigerian history, which is the country that my father is from. And when I saw the British colonial flag of Nigeria, I was blown away at the fact that it appeared that the Star of David was on our flag, and I wondered why. Now, believe it or not, Nigeria is a fairly new country. It was created in 1914 when Britain combined the protectorates of northern and southern Nigeria. Prior to British colonialism, this region of Africa was divided across tribal lines. In fact, the name Nigeria is just a combination of the word Niger, which is a river in Nigeria, and the word area. And this was coined by a woman by the name of Flora Shaw, who was the Governor General's wife. Prior to Nigeria, it was known as the Royal Niger Corporation Territories. So this part of West Africa was essentially created to be an oil corporation. First, they focused on cultivating and selling palm oil, and then later crude oil. In fact, most of Shell's gasoline comes from Nigeria. According to Lord Lugard, who was, again, the Governor General of colonial Nigeria, this seal that we see here, known as the Seal of Solomon, was found on a quote, very handsome goblet found in northern Nigeria. And according to an Igbo scholar by the name of Dr. Ojukwu, the goblet he was referring to was used in Igbo chieftaincy ceremonies. So again, it just seems like a very strange thing to put on a flag. Again, this is in the early to mid 1900s, so this is well into the European Jewish population had already adopted this symbol as a sort of identity marker. So this is just a very interesting thing to put on the flag. And it gets a bit stranger. They also minted coins with this symbol too. This is actually a coin of mine. It says British West Africa, as you can see. And this is a 1/10 of a penny minted in 1939. So according to, okay, we've gone over that. Almost repeated myself there. So this coin was minted well before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. It just seems like a very strange, again, coincidence that, you know, a large portion of people who were enslaved in Western Africa would later have a coin with the Star of David on it, and they'd be taken to a country that has pyramids on their money. It just seems very, very. It's too coincidental for to just be a coincidence, if that makes sense. Now, when I asked my dad about these coins, I showed it to him. Like, wow, you guys have been using these pennies. He just kind of shrugged it off and said, never really paid attention to that. And to be fair, during his life and the life of most Nigerians, in the early 1900s, or I should say mid 1900s, my father's not that old. The main concern of many Nigerians was education, getting out of poverty, food, and survival. None of the other, excuse me, something else that's very strange. None of the other British colonies of West Africa had coins with both the colony's name and the Star of David minted on them. This was something unique to Nigeria. Now, the British West African coins were used across the colonies, but it didn't specify the name of that colony. Only Nigerian coins had the symbol on them along with their name. Now, again, this is just something that it blew my mind when I came across it. It's just a very, very unique piece of history. So, what is the Star of David? This triangle star, also sometimes referred to as the Seal of Solomon. Now, although the Star of David is widely regarded as a Jewish symbol, it didn't start out that way. According to the JewishVirtualLibrary.com, the Magen David, which means the Star of David, was used as early as the Bronze Age for both ornamental and magical purposes. It existed in places as far apart as Mesopotamia, Britain, India, and the Iberian Peninsula before the Roman conquest. In the 17th century, the symbol was used amongst followers of the Kabbalah, who deemed it as the shield of the Son of David, meaning the Messiah. Some actually believed that the Messiah was a man named Sabbatai Zevi in the year 1666. And that man, he was a devout Talmudic scholar and a devotee of Kabbalah. He believed that he was the Messiah and caused all of his followers to believe that they could force the Most High to return by committing as much sin as humanly possible. And it's a very interesting but disturbing piece of history, but it just goes to show you that there have been a lot of people who've come around and claimed to be the Messiah and done some very anti-messianic things. Now, it wasn't until the late 1800s that European Jews began to use the symbol to denote their Jewish identity. And nowadays, this symbolic star has become synonymous with Judaism. So when I came across these coins, along with our British colonial flag, I couldn't help but wonder if this in any way gave more legitimacy to us being descendants of the ancient Hebrew or Jewish diaspora. And I really think that it does. Now, and I'm not alone here. Here's the DNA test result of an Igbo author by the name of Remy Alona. It's just taken from an excerpt from his book titled Igbo in Abraham's DNA. Now, as you can see, the man, he's 100% Igbo. He grew up in Nigeria, born and raised. 92.9% of his DNA is from Nigeria. 5.9% is in Kenya, and then he has a 1.2% in the Middle East. Now, in his book, he does contest the manner in which DNA is tested to prove a person's possible ancestry to the ancient Israelites, and it's a very, very, very enlightening read. And here's a quote by an author that I came across. Named Yanwe Okeke. She wrote a book entitled Judah Awakening, in which she says the following. I uploaded my raw DNA data to gedmatch.com for my ancestry heritage admixture analysis. It was an interesting activity. Among all the colorful admixtures, I have a low percentage of Middle Eastern. In addition, I saw a few other Igbo people's raw DNA results. Some have more significant percentages of Middle Eastern than I do, while some even have Palestinian admixture readings as well. End quote. So this shows that this isn't something people aren't crazy when they're looking for these things. There's a lot of information that just seems too convenient, too coincidental to not be pointing towards something else. And I'll take it a step further. Uh, this was something that my father told me randomly in passing this year. It turns out that Israel actually helped the Igbos during our civil war. Um, During the 1960s, the Igbos sought to secede from Nigeria in order to form their own independent state known as Biafra. In 1966, um, anti-Igbo program was a series of massacres committed against Igbo people and other people of southern Nigerian origin living in northern Nigeria. Now, in August of 1968, the Israeli Air Force overtly sent 12 tons of food aid to a nearby site outside of Nigerian Biafran airspace. Covertly, the Mossad, which is Israel's version of it's pretty much Israel's CIA, they provided the Igbo Biafra with $100,000 through Zurich and attempted an arms shipment. Now, soon after this, Israel arranged to make clandestine weapon shipments to Biafra using Cote d'Ivoire transport planes. And Israel also developed a cultural relation with Igbos based on the possible shared traditions. Now, this was something that was remarkable to me because my father told me that had it not been for Israel's aid, we would have been wiped out. The Igbos were pretty much on our own. It was the majority of the other Nigerians were against the Igbo. Different countries were in support of the North against the Igbo too. And here's an interesting quote, or I should say a powerful quote, by a man by the name of Zach Levy, who wrote this article entitled Israel, Nigeria, and the Biafra Civil War. And I'm just going to read an excerpt. At the same time, the plight of the Igbos reminded many Israelis of the Holocaust. So there was a deep emotional and a spiritual connection going on. It just seems way too... I'm trying to figure out why. I'm really trying to get to what caused this to happen. And when I learned about that, I came across similarities to other Jewish community aid. Now, during the late 40s, early 50s, Israel actually began to airlift different Jewish communities back to the state of Israel. The first of which was called Operation Magic Carpet. And Israel began to airlift many Yemenite Jews, that is, Jews from Yemen, to Israel. Now, the same happened with Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel that we talked about earlier in the presentation. Now, the first operation was titled Operation Moses, and it helped to return, or I should say, it helped to rescue 140,000 members of, wow, my mistake, I read the wrong number here. It brought back more than 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel, and today that number is roughly 140,000 as of November 29th, 2017. And they had more operations. There was another one in the 90s called Operation Solomon, which airlifted 14,000 Jews out of Ethiopia to Israel. And even this year, Benjamin Netanyahu airlifted 500 Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia back to Israel. So I'm going to wrap all of this up. So what did Africans believe before slavery? Once again, it was various traditional African spiritual systems which varied depending on your tribe, location, and the time period. Judaism in many different places throughout the continent, Islam, not always by force, some by choice, and early Christianity, as we've seen with the Apostle Mark and his church in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, I'd like to leave you all with this quote once again. Don't blindly believe anything that you've seen in this video. Please do your research. I cannot stress that enough. There's nothing preventing anyone from creating a video and throwing it up on the internet. And just because something may have a lot of views does not make it true. So I'd encourage everyone to aggressively do your own research. Find people to talk to. Look for rare books. Look for articles, scholastic journals, anything that you can find that can help broaden your understanding of the world. And I'd like to give a huge shout out to these two channels. They've been very helpful in keeping me just informed about things as it relates to things in the media and keeping my faith strong. The first is Theology Ed. He's a Christian researcher who has some very in-depth videos about predictive programming in a lot of our media. And Truth Unedited does some very, very deep research about Christian theology, eschatology, and other things. Very, very great content that they both have. Now, if you got something out of this presentation, I'd encourage you to pay it forward. Mr. George would always teach me to do that. And to pay it forward just means instead of giving to a person who gave you something, you make it a mission to give something to someone else. So especially now, if you have a neighbor, buy them some groceries. Cash up someone $10 and say, hey, just thought you could use some gas money, something. Or, just send somebody a positive message. It'll go a long way. We're all going through it in this quarantine, so I hope this helped you all in some way. If it did, great. If not, well, at least you killed 3 hours. So thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate it, and stay safe, and God bless. Peace.